Do. All right, we're live. Matt, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good.
Awesome, awesome. Where are you at, by the way?
I live in the south of England, UK.
Okay, cool, cool.
Yeah.
I'm in Oregon in the U.S. Are you familiar with Oregon?
No, my US geography is not great, to be
A lot
honest.
of people are not familiar with Oregon, so we are the state directly above California.
Oh, right. Oh,
So,
okay. So weather decent?
yeah, it rains a lot here. We have a lot of greenery. A lot of things grow here versus most places in the U.S. But yeah, it's not quite as nice as like California, but it's also prettier to look at. So yeah. But yeah, no, it's nice here. I like it. Okay, so we're gonna talk about veganism. You are not a vegan, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Okay. And yeah, I'll go ahead and let you start it off because you might have a few things you want to work into this conversation. So yeah,
Yeah. If you don't mind, I will introduce my Nations of Sanity project 'cause I think it will provide a
yeah,
good context for where I'm coming from with regards to the vegan aspect as well. But basically, the Nations of Sanity project is a project I kind of champion that basically is based on the assertion that crime and therefore law, as well as the concepts of rights and freedom, can be and should be objectively defined by the concept of individual self-ownership. And the specific proposal that I kind of present through the Nation's Sanity Project is to say that we should establish this principle as the law through a universal peace agreement. So rather than have governments decide what is and isn't crime, I say that basically we can define crime and law by the concept of individual self-ownership. So if we start with the idea that everyone has right over themselves and only themselves, then what is and isn't a crime and where your freedoms and rights begin and end is kind of objectively identifiable based on that presupposition that you've already established of individual self-ownership. And the reason why I was keen to speak about veganism is because obviously as soon as you start talking about rights, the question of animal rights is an obvious question to come into that conversation.
gotcha.
So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay, well let's break down this idea without the veganism side, and then we'll bring veganism into it. So okay, so and this is a form of the I don't know I'm fascinated by politics, but I'm not too politically minded. This is some form of anarchy, correct? Like anarcho something something. What do you
Yeah.
describe this as?
I call it voluntarism. I prefer that as a term, but I'm happy with
Okay.
anarchism. I'm even happy with libertarianism, even though I think it's very different to a lot of the problem with a lot of these words is they have different meanings to different people. And the reason
Okay.
why I like voluntarism the best is because I think it's most explicit about what this is about, which is the voluntary aspects of a just society and the inherent self ownership. I think anarchism alludes to that because the whole no rulers aspect of anarchism kind of, if you think, well, why no rulers? Well, because we all own ourselves and no one has right to rule over us. So
Mm.
it's very heavily implied, but I think it's more explicit in voluntarism. And libertarianism is also kind of, invokes the same basic principles of self ownership and the non
Okay.
aggression principle, which is, kind of what this is centered around.
Gotcha. Okay. So just so you know, I usually classify myself as a libertarian if I have to choose, because I have not thoroughly researched all the political parties. That's just kind of the political philosophy I ascribe to from what I've seen. So yeah, I think for the most part, though, aside from me telling you that, we could stay away from labels. We don't have to call what you're talking to a certain name. But let's imagine that me and you live near each other and we're out in the wild. Society hasn't been created, at least for the people near us. And there's a bunch of people out. We have all these different tribes. And in my mind, the most important thing humans can do is get together, talk, and decide to make a society. You decide, okay, these are our borders. We'll have a military of sorts because we know there could be outside threat. Um, but most importantly, in my mind, why you'd create a society with a bunch of humans working together would be protection. You'd want there to be a prison and law enforcement to make it to where all the things you're describing. So what I always refer to as negative rights, that those are protected, and therefore there are consequences for that. And I usually assume there must need to be a government of sorts to run this. Now, as we can see throughout all of history, there are complications, and it seems like nowadays in most first world countries, we somewhat have governments that are doing it somewhat right. There's probably a lot of changes that need to be made, but I can't imagine what me and you both want as far as our negative rights not violated to run smoothly without there being a government of sorts. Can you explain to me how, if me and you were out in nature and we were saying like, hey, let's get together and make this decision, if you do it without forming a government, how would it run?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where we have to be clear on our definitions, because I've had this conversation with people where I've been said, yeah, you can have a government, and I've also said you can't have a government, and it's kind of depending on what you mean by government. So
Okay.
if we take the definition of government as a ruling authority, then I would say that you can't have that, because that in itself is a criminal element. Like, it violates the self ownership that we've already spoken of. If you have an authority that claims rule over others, so that under that negative rights that you spoke about, and this, or the concept of individual self ownership that I kind of speak about, is being violated by having any kind of authority, king, queen, even a democratic government that is claiming rule over other people. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have a collective. And one of the things I present with the Nations of Sanity project is a sort of alternative to government, although you could still call it government if you kind of we're going to change the definition to include voluntary governments, if you like, or non-coercive governments, or governments that were in line with this concept of individual self-ownership. So that's why I say
Mhm.
about the definition depends. But if we agree that, say, just for the sake of this conversation, if we agree that government is a ruling entity, then I would say that you would need to replace those governments or convert those governments to what I would call a voluntary collective. So we can still have, because everything you said about why we need what you referred to as governments, I pretty much agree with. We need to collectivize, we need to, for our collective security, as well as many other aspects of society, we need to work together. But the problem is when we have this organization that violates the very right we want them to protect, we have a conflict there. We have a contradiction. We're saying to these people, okay, well, you can kind of override our self-ownership and claim rule over us and create laws and such and such and such, if you'll only protect us from people that might do those things that we're giving you the power to do. So that's my
Mm.
problem with government as a ruling entity. But I fully accept, and one of my problems with a lot of other anarchists is they have this kind of, particularly free market anarchists who just want to quote unquote let the market decide, is that doesn't mean we don't still need a lot of what government does also represent, which is
Hmm.
this collective ownership, this collective effort, this collective organization, these societal norms, all of these things. But my point is such an organization must operate within the confines of this like law that I want to establish of individual self-ownership defining crime. Like for example, this government or this collective, whatever you would want to call it, cannot make laws. It can only enforce the law that is objectively identifiable by the concept of individual self-ownership. It
Hmm.
can't. It doesn't. It cannot wield ruling authorities over people to be able to violate them. So that's. I hope I don't know if that's
Okay. Yeah.
clear,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Yeah.
that's
You're
kind
fine.
of my distinction. Yeah.
Okay. Let me try to challenge some of this, or at least try
Yeah.
to further understand it. What city do you live in?
Chichester is the name of my city.
Ooh, I'm not going to be able to
It's not
pronounce
very
that.
well known.
No. No.
It's near, probably. I mean, it's south of London. It's on the south coast, but it's sort of in between Brighton and Portsmouth as two maybe
Okay.
better known parts of England.
Brighton's going to work for me as far as pronouncing. Okay, so we have London and we have Brighton. Now, let's
Okay.
say that we decide, because we don't have a ruling government, but we do have collectives. I'm guessing the collectives would be decided based on like they'd be smaller, correct? Like in London, and maybe even London would be split up into smaller, but let's say it's not. Would you imagine something like the people who, like, if there is like a let's say there was a horrible crime, somebody stabbed somebody and maybe it was caught on film or something, there would be at least groups of people that were volunteers of sorts or whatever in London that would gather together to work towards deciding the fate of the person that was stabbing, right? And maybe the collective in Brighton would have no connection to it because they're their own community. Do I gather that idea right?
Well, I mean, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. I mean, that scenario
Okay.
certainly could happen, but it's not the size that's the issue. It's the nature of it. So, like when you say about it, they would be smaller collectives. They could be, and they may well likely be, but they don't have to be. It could be it could be a national collective like we have now with a
Okay.
government. It's the nature, not the size of it, that's important. So, as long as that government didn't claim any rule over us, didn't claim any right to violate our individual rights of self-ownership, and was literally just a giant voluntary collective that was, doing these things, then that it
Hmm.
could be national, it could even be global. I don't think that's
Yeah.
very likely because of the diversity of people, and I think there's lots of different ways people would want to collectivize where they wouldn't perhaps want to associate with others, but you could still have these sort of this kind of universal terms of peace between people.
Okay.
One of the sorry to don't want to tangent too much, but
No,
one
you're
of the
fine.
purposes of these collectives as well is even if you had this sort of universal law that everyone understood and wouldn't all necessarily abide by, but they all understood it and accepted it as this law, but they could still have separate collectives where they had kind of more specific ideals that they agreed to, but they would only be subject to them because they agreed to. It's like, like you could have like for example, you could have a membership of a club or a church or any kind of collective where you agree to things that aren't necessarily other people don't have to abide to because they're not part of your club, but everybody
Hmm.
has to abide by the no rape, no murder, no theft, no assault, because that's part of the
Okay.
universal terms of peace. But with regards to these collectives, it's not about the size, it's about the nature. So as long as they were operating within that paradigm, it doesn't matter how big or small they are. I'm sorry, but to carry
Okay,
on
no,
what you
you're
were saying.
fine. So my concern would be that each of these collectives, one of them might try to get out of the nature of what we're talking about, and therefore would there be an overarching redefined government of England that would make sure that if Brighton is stepping out of line, they stop stepping out of line?
Well, there could. What I'm saying is there could be, but there could also, like with what I'm proposing, you could have under that of what I'm proposing, you could have that, and you could also not have that. Like it doesn't dictate one way or another that you've got a national overriding authority that's demanding all of the individual counties or states or however the collectives are broken up are behaving properly within each other. You might just have like a peace agreement, a little bit like the nations of the world have today between each other, like an international peace agreement. Like you don't have a ruling one world government that tells all the countries they've got to behave this way, but they'll have like a universal like international law or something like that. So it would be more kind of like that. Now you could have like is like I say, I'm not saying that you couldn't have. It's neither demanded or prohibited by what I'm proposing. It's like both is
Hmm.
possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. I'm just trying to see how it plays out, just as far as like, because I've heard different anarchist ideas talked about, and so I'm just trying to make sure I separate what I've heard before from what I'm hearing from you, because
Sure.
a lot of times it seems like the each group would kind of be in control. Therefore, like the small mob of that area, if they all happen to align with some idea, like where normally somebody would say um, that people that sexually assault small children normally maybe would just go to jail for a very long time, if maybe even for life. Where maybe one town might say, "Oh, we actually castrate you and hang you upside down from your feet." So, I just am wondering, like, so in the U.S. and in the U.K., there's kind of a thing set up where if Brighton decides to do this, the overarching government is going to say no, no, you cannot do this. So with yours, there would be, even though it would be a very different government than we have today, there would be a government that might say like your collective can't choose this.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be a government. It would just be this peace agreement, essentially, and I suppose anyone that goes against. So even without, let's say, for example, as I say, although you could have like a larger national collective that's kind of policing these smaller collectives, you could have that. But let's just take the scenario where you don't have that. So you've got
Okay.
all of these little collectives, but you don't have a larger one that's policing them with any kind of authority. So you've just got all these collectives, and all they're doing is working under this universal peace agreement that they're either agreeing to or simply not violating. So kind of
Okay. So
tacitly agreeing to. So
you're
what's
good.
telling them they can't step out over a certain line would be this universal peace agreement. It wouldn't be any particular, like I say, because the whole premise of this is that nobody has authority over anybody else.
Mhm.
We just have this principle of individual self-ownership that's telling us what is and isn't a crime in a relatively low resolution way. And there is an aspect with regards to the grey areas and fuzzy edges that need addressing with regards to, I mean, funnily enough, what you're talking about with regards to what would be a proportional response, because you could have, like under the universal peace agreement, there could be it could be everyone can agree under that premise that, for example, you can do something against criminals, but what you
Mhm.
can do, there isn't a hard, sharp scientific answer as to
Mhm.
what proportional and justifiable response is. There's more of a kind of wide area where there's like a reasonable interpretation but then there's also a line that kind of segregates that reasonable interpretation to when it's no longer reasonable. So for
Okay.
example, like for example, self-defense, what would be reasonable self-defense, or what would be a reasonable punishment for a certain crime? There would be a
Mhm.
kind of gray area, and then there would be the black and white, where okay, now you're definitely stepping beyond proportionate and necessary response to this crime. And and that's when that line would be drawn, but that would be part of like the overall agreement. With regards to the gray areas, then you've got to say, well, okay, again, and it always has to come back to this principle of everyone having equal right over themselves. So if
Mhm.
someone committed a crime against me, say for example, or my family, say I was the person with the best sort of, like I was the victim, or I was closest to that victim if that person say died or something, like, but say
Mhm.
the right of retribution was for me before it was anybody else, let's say.
Mhm.
um as long as I'm working within the gray area, then what's the word, would decide, the right to decide within that gray area would be
Mhm.
mine, but I
Oh,
wouldn't be able
okay.
to step beyond that grey area. I wouldn't be able to step over it into a black and white thing where I'm now committing a crime myself because I've gone beyond what is within the. But because the thing is what is a proportional response to a crime isn't an exact answer. We can't say this is definitely anything more or less than this exact action is unjustified. That, like we say, we can accept the fuzzy edges, but we can also accept that there's a limit to those fuzzy edges. There's a limit to the grey area where we can kind of agree to disagree. And this kind of
Mhm.
universal agreement, as well as establishing the basic principle, it's also about setting these, what I call the lines in the sand, or the limits of tolerance over differing interpretations. At the risk of labouring my explanation too much, one sort of metaphor I like to use when I talk about this is I talk about the desert versus the grassland, like geographically speaking. And I think of
Mhm.
the desert as a description of what's definitely a crime, what's definitely a violation of the non-aggression principle, and then the
Mhm.
grassland of what's definitely not, and you're free to do because you're just exercising your right. And then like the in-between area is representing this grey area where we can't quite say for certain. And what this peace agreement is about saying is saying, okay, well, what we need to do is preserve the definition of desert and grassland by saying, okay, well, when you're in the space where there's no features of grassland left, when because things, if you walk from grassland area slowly towards the deserts, there's not a straight line. Slowly the land becomes more arid. Slowly you eventually walk into the desert where nothing, you're only surrounded by sand. And my point is when you're only surrounded by sand, you're definitely in the desert. That's definitely the desert, and you should be able to declare that. And likewise for the grassland. And for this in between area, basically no one can enforce that, because no one has a right to say, oh, well, we want to draw the line here, we want to draw a line here, because we've already established that this is the grey area, this is the area in between where features of both exist and reasonable people can agree to disagree. And in those
Mhm.
situations we need to fall back on self-ownership again to see who can decide who can decide within that grey area. So one example I use is like child abuse, for example. The difference between my difference of opinion on how the best way to raise your child and me saying, okay, now you're guilty of child abuse. Now you're a criminal. Now people should be able to come and take your child away from you. Now,
Mhm.
what we're saying is with the black and white standard, if it's falling into that, yeah, beyond reasonable doubt, you're violating your duty of care as guardian over your child and you're abusing your child. It's not just a difference of opinion over best parenting, it's actual abuse. Then you've
Mhm.
stepped over that black and white line. But all the time you're in the grey area where we can agree to disagree, then your right as the guardian of your child trumps my right. So let's say it was like
Mm.
vaccinations, for example, and we had this disagreement over whether the child should be vaccinated, and it's a grey area over what's the best thing. Okay, well then it's the parent's decision because it's a
Mhm.
grey area, and the parent has a greater right to decide within that grey area because the parent is the rightful guardian of the child, and the outside community isn't. But once that parent clearly, beyond a reasonable doubt, steps over the line of what is a reasonable doubt thing, and then we're like, no, now they are clearly violating their role as guardian and they're actually abusing this child, then we would be justified in stepping in. Does that make sense? Sorry, I went
Gotcha.
on a bit.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. So what I want to figure out. Okay, so let's say the UK all agrees to this. They switch over to this way of living. The government becomes this new definition. We won't have queens and kings anymore. Okay, so this happens. And then let's say after everybody agrees and this starts, that we have Brighton. Brighton decides they want to do something extreme. Everybody in that city decides let's take something like physical violence without any markings. So somebody just doesn't like somebody, they think they looked at them funny, they punch them really hard in the face. Let's say Brighton just says, you know what, we don't think this is a crime, we don't think this is a problem. Um, but the start of this new way of living, that is a problem. And so I guess what my thoughts would be is, so who in the UK would like would the government that is there, that is redefined, would they go to Brighton and say, I get that your entire collective feels this way, but we are forcing you to not do this? And what does that force look like? And who are they?
Well, yeah, because, and if I'm understanding your example correctly, if Brighton are in violation of this principle because
Mm-hmm.
they're allowing assault or participating in an assault on somebody, which they don't view it as, if they're
Mm-hmm.
stepping over that black and white line, then yes, anybody, whether it's an outside force or whether it's people within Brighton who are, rebelling on their own or whatever, would have the right. They basically, in that scenario, Brighton would be the criminals because they're committing a crime, and we've already
Mm-hmm.
established what crime is through this universal concept. So the
Mm-hmm.
the authority, if you like, that we're acting with isn't any ruling authority that we have over Brighton. It's simply the fact that we're acting in defense of this principle. So I mean, one of the things about law enforcement, one of the beauties of law enforcement, if law was defined by this concept, is enforcing the law would be by definition simply defensive act, because all we're doing is preserving people's individual rights of individual self-ownership, and we're only using force when to obviously when people are in violation or threatening to violate that. So
Mm-hmm.
so the people, whether they come from outside or within, in that scenario, and again, whether they're successful or not, because obviously some people have given me the example of, okay, well, what if it's a part of the world where we can't intervene, like the entire country of Saudi Arabia is oppressing its people, and we just can't do anything about it because we don't have the military might and blah, 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 or it would cause more innocent harm life, and whatever the reason, it's like, okay, well, that's different. But if we did have the ability to, we would be morally justified in it, because the person who's initiating the force is the criminal, and the person who's using the force to prevent or stop that violation, that crime, is just they're protecting this concept. It all comes back to this
Mm-hmm.
concept of individual self-ownership. You're either violating it or you're protecting it.
Yeah.
And if you're protecting it, then you're enforcing the law, and if you're violating it, then you're breaking it. So yeah, in that Brighton
Mm-hmm.
example, Brighton would be criminals because they're committing a crime, Assuming we're not talking about something that's within the grey areas, we're talking about actual crimes like punching someone on the face,
Hmm. Yeah.
then yes.
Okay. Um, and so there would be a prison. And I guess in this case, nobody would necessarily need to go to prison. It would just be whatever voluntary government of the UK would go to Brighton and say they would meet up with the volunteer leaders of Brighton as a collective, and they would say, "Hey, you guys, you can't do this anymore. Like these laws are being broken. If somebody breaks the law, then they have to be punished. You can't just say that you're making new laws that goes against the." The no aggression principle. Okay, so what if Brighton says, "No, we don't want to. We're just going to keep doing this." Would whoever the people that are saying no, like the volunteers of Brighton's community as their leaders, would they go to jail?
Potentially they could. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, with regards to proportional force, that's always something can be escalated by the aggressor. So, like, I mean, I remember one person giving me the example of, oh, like, do you think it's justified to shoot somebody who was trying to steal your property? And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
well, on its own, no, because property isn't as valuable as a life. But there may be a situation where that could be the crime that's initiated, and then that person could escalate the situation. Like, for example, you're allowed to use necessary force to prevent the theft, but then if they then escalated it to the point that it became a lethal encounter where you ended
Mm-hmm.
up killing them, they've escalated it to that situation. So, like, even if initially Brighton's crime didn't warrant prison, if they
Mm-hmm.
continued and persisted it, then they're kind of doing your job for you with regards to demonstrating why they do belong in prison, because they're making other options. They're kind of making it so that the only justifiable, proportionate and necessary action may well be. I mean, not necessarily, it depends on the specifics, but it certainly
Yeah.
could be. I mean, I wouldn't rule. I mean, again, this is the thing with the grey area. I wouldn't, like, you could have some areas that have the death penalty because there are certain crimes where you could make a reasonable argument that that would be warranted, but there's
Mm-hmm.
also areas that could decide that they don't want to do the death penalty, and they don't necessarily have to, because and if they've got the right of over that a grey area because they're the offended party, then that's something that can be done. I mean, that's something that else has been put to me many times. Like, some people say, well, would you have the death penalty? And I was like, well, you could, but you could also potentially not, and that would depend on
Mm-hmm.
the people who are the victims of the said crime. But certainly proportional responses could include something like that.
Okay.
It could include prison, but it could also not. There's lots of different options available. But if the person who's committing the crime is removing those options, you know what I mean? If you're trying to get
Mm-hmm.
someone out of your house without using lethal force, and they refuse to the point that you've got to escalate the force, and then they end up making it escalate to the point that you end up using worse force up to and including killing them,
Mm-hmm.
then that's on them. But if you just shot dead some child who was retrieving her ball in your yard, that's not
Mm-hmm.
proportionate and necessary response. But if it's some person who's openly attacking you, and then it's a different story, and then it's not about just the trespassing or the property violation. It's about all the other things that they're escalating and threatening, and you're the one justified in stopping them from the crime. They're not the ones
Mm-hmm.
justified in the continuation of their crime.
Gotcha. Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
and one other thing I'd like
Yeah.
to add, if I could as well,
Mm-hmm.
with regards to these collectives not being able to make their own laws, they can't make their own laws. As I say, laws should be defined by this concept, but they can make their own rules. And there's an important distinction to be made between laws and rules, because it's like, if I invite you into my house, I can have a rule in my house that you got to take your shoes off. Now, that's not a
Mm-hmm.
law, because you don't have to take your shoes off in your own house. It's just a rule that I'm establishing as part of an agreement for you to enter my house. And if you refuse, I can refuse to let you in my house. It's part of
Mm-hmm.
an agreement. If I want you could join my club, and part of this club is you've got to be circumcised, and you say, okay, well, I don't want to be circumcised. I say, that's fine, I'm not forcing you, it's not a law, but it is a rule of this club, if you want to be a
Mm-hmm.
member of it, that you've got to do those things. So, because that's the other thing as well, it's like, I'm not against collectives having their own kind of standards that they want to have, but those things can only be a part of people that agree to be part of their way of life. But when it comes, but we still need these kind of universal laws that regardless of what collective you're a part of, and even if you're not a part of a collective, even if you're this completely solitary person who doesn't want to be a part of anything, the one rule you do have to obey is this kind of law as defined by the concept of individual self-ownership. So, you don't have to be circumcised, you don't have to follow a religion, but you do have to not murder, rape, rob, assault, etc. So
Okay, gotcha. Okay. Um, awesome. Okay, I'm gonna think a lot of that over, and I'm gonna rewatch that part of the conversation and take notes, and I'm gonna have a lot of follow up questions for you. But now let's hop over to veganism.
yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Well, as I mentioned, I'm not a vegan myself, but I have a lot of respect for vegans, in particularly with regards to animal rights, because obviously this conversation about rights and individual self-ownership, one question that is put to me is, well, do animals have rights? Is there any moral argument for animals having rights? And I say that there is, and they do. And then people will say, well, how can you justify not being a vegan then? Because, you're not eating people, but you're happy to eat animals. Now,
Mm-hmm.
my justification of this, and it's not watertight, because one of the things I have to accept, and there's a certain hypocrisy in my stance, by the fact that as much as I could talk about idyllic, humane farming, the reality isn't that way now. And the way we treat farm animals is nothing short of evil, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that the fact that I'm not a vegan myself, I could be seen as supporting that in some kind of way. But my argument is we could still have animal rights, and we can still have animal farming. And the reason why we can have both is because we can invoke something that's referred to as implicit contract or implicit consent. And this ties to another question that some people have asked me about, things like, oh, well, how can you have children without their consent? Because you obviously can't get consent of who you're bringing into this world. And you have
Mm-hmm.
this idea, or how can you act for people that can't express their consent? And this also applies to animals, because obviously animals can't express their consent. And what you can
Mm-hmm.
do is you can invoke what we call implicit contract and implicit consent, where you can say, okay, well, it's reasonable to assume that if they were presented with this choice, that they would or could choose this. And it's reasonable for us to make this contract on their behalf, that as long as I raise my child reasonably well, then certainly don't abuse them, then it's reasonable to assume that they would want me to bring them into this world. They would choose existence over non-existence. Now, with the animal thing, and it might seem like a little bit of a stretch, but I still think it works within this concept, is I can say, okay, let's just say we have obviously, we've got vegans in the world, but we also have people that want to continue eating meat. Let's just say that we can do that, but we can provide farming practices where we can meet the burden of implicit contract, where we can provide a life to the farm animals that is sufficient, that would be preferable to non-existence. So that, because the one thing that I've heard mentioned sort of in opposition to veganism is, what happens to all the farm animals if all of us, let's say tomorrow, the whole world became vegan, and obviously the meat industries collapse and what have you, and a lot of the animal way they're treated, admittedly, non-existence would be preferable to the suffering that many of them go through. But but what do we do? Do we do a mass call of all these animals? Some of them might become pets and be able to live in sanctuaries and stuff, but it's probably not going to be the case for the vast majority of them. And my argument is well, they could still continue and they could still exist with people, still farming them, if we can kind of have this like standard of humane farming that's based on the concept of implicit contract. So like, if we can, and I know it seems very idyllic, but I just think that would be preferable to them not existing at all. And I kind of use it to my own example is let's imagine there was some kind of super advanced godlike alien species that was farming us. Let's imagine that planet Earth was literally a farm, and at the end of our lives, some of which are cut shorter than others, they're part of some cosmic thing where they like eat us at the end of it or whatever. And it's just some kind of cycle we go through. They're farming, somewhat hard to imagine way. But I could imagine that they would have some kind of moral structure where they would accept us having like rights, but they would accept that we can't understand the choice of non-existence or like the whole situation that they're in. But if we could, and we were asked, would we want to exist or not, we would choose in the affirmative that we would exist under those terms. you know, and
Mm.
it's kind of like creating something somewhat similar with regards to our farming practices, where there's a certain humane standard that's demanded by the fact that we have to meet the burden of implicit consent or implicit contract, so that these animals have a life where we could say, okay, they would be, we could, we're doing a, because it's like we're doing an agreement without their actual agreement, but we can
Hmm.
reasonably assume that if they were able to be part of this agreement, if they would be able to come to the table as intellectual equivalents, they would agree to it. Now, that's obviously not reasonable if we're continuing what's the predominant farming practices of today, and
Hmm.
giving them miserable lives. But for example, and the thing is as well, what is a humane life for a cow is a lot different to what's a humane life for a person. It's not humane to put a person in a field with a bunch of other people for its life, just to kind of wander around doing not much. But
Hmm.
that would be a pretty decent life for a cow. So what's
Hmm.
required to give them a decent life that would meet that burden isn't quite as high as some people might believe, because some people might say, oh, well, that's, the cost involved would be prohibitive to the point of, you know but I think, if we can't do things without committing tremendous evil, then we shouldn't do
Hmm.
things. Now, my point is that doesn't mean that we get rid of farming. It just means we have to drastically change it to the point that it's no longer evil and we meet this kind of standard. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
No, it does. It does. And I kind of like it. It's definitely better than what we currently have. I would agree that there's something like, have you ever seen the documentary Blackfish on orcas? Okay.
I don't think so.
It's a thing that shows like in captivity, like at like SeaWorld when they have like orcas and dolphins and stuff like that. Their fins will like flop over in a way that never happens in the wild, and they're very emotional. And anyways, it's just an interesting thing where it shows, and I think their life's cut in half maybe, for how long they live. Um, but I think they're probably, if we did not get away from owning, breeding, and eating animals, I would say that the most humane thing to do would be something like what you're talking about, where we would figure out which animals would be basically feeling the same way in captivity that they would not. So if we go out and we were to, I mean, it's complicated because the animals we have are all domesticated. So we can't really go out, like we can go out and see what an orca's doing and see, okay, SeaWorld isn't big enough to make it feel like it's at home. Where if a chicken lived out in the wild, we could go see like how far do they usually walk around, what's the extent of of what they need to feel like they're not trapped, like do they feel are they going to get claustrophobic in this area where there's plenty of grass and they're out in the sunshine. And I think those are ways that we could recognize what's at least more humane than what we have. um, but as far as if it's acceptable overall, I think we would need a better justification than somebody just wanting to do something. Like, I want to consume this thing. So, my first question to you would be, if the aliens were doing this, and let's say we're aware of this, and the aliens tell us, like, we don't want to factory farm you guys. We're going to give you good lives. We're going to give you, this, that, and the other, and then we're going to let you live out to be 70, and then we're going to kill you and eat you, but we'll kill you so humanely. Um, do you think, you personally, this is something you would want the human race to fight, to try to fight off the aliens?
I think it would depend on the alternative. I think there's more I would need to know about the situation, because
Hmm.
let's say, for example, if let's say, I'm having a conversation with this alien that's farming me, and
Hmm.
obviously I've got a lot of questions about, okay, let's just say he says, okay, well, look, this is the only way you exist. Okay, like we're creating you
Hmm.
for this purpose. It's either don't exist or exist like this. So is this a life worth living to you? Is this a life that you want, or would you rather just not exist at all? Because, like, if we didn't do this, you wouldn't exist. That would be kind of like their argument, in a way that I would feel is an analogous, the same as
Analogous? Analogous, yeah.
Analogous, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
I do that all the time.
that's
I'm in the middle of talking, and once I say a word wrong, I'm like, I can't even think of what the word is.
yeah, yeah. I needed you on that one. But yeah, but that will be kind of most similar to like the farming example, because like certainly the conversation I could have with a cow is you're not a wild animal.
Hmm.
It's not like your alternative is some idyllic wildlife. And if we were to put you in the wild, you would probably like you certainly wouldn't have anything better about your life than what we can provide you in this open field that's got certain protections. And you'd also have a lot of things that would be less good about this life, as in you'd have the absence of the protections, and you'd be subject to predators that you're not really as capable from defending because you've been domestic.
Hmm.
You're almost a creation of domestication. It's a little bit like the difference between wolves and dogs, even though that's not as extreme, because dogs would probably be a bit more capable in the wild because they've got enough of their wolfery ancestry. But
Hmm.
cows of today are pretty much almost. I mean, obviously not a human creation because we selectively breed them. We didn't create them out of nothing, but
Hmm.
they don't exist as they would have in the wild.
Yeah.
So there's not really a plate. There's not really an alternative for them. They either exist as farm animals or they don't exist at all. With a few exceptions of pets and what have you. So
Hmm.
um, I think that's another because that's another motivation in here. It's not just me trying to justify my meat eating or
Yeah, you're
or,
fine.
or envisage a world where I can continue to. It's also thinking about kind of like, well, even if I was a vegan, I've heard vegans even speak about this in regards to like the problem of, well, what do we do with all the farm animals kind of
Oh,
thing.
I know
If we
exactly what to do.
okay, go on.
Oh,
I'm
I'm
keen
saving
to hear.
that. I'll tell you in a sec.
All
But
right, okay.
for no, I'll just tell you there's a lot of answers, but the easiest answer that I think all vegans should go to is to kill them all. Just wipe them all out. The Now there are probably better methods that would be nice, but I would say better than what we currently have, better than especially with factory farming, better than breeding them into existence to have this horrible life and die. If we kill them all now, that's the best thing. The next best thing would be killing them all tomorrow. And then the next best thing would be killing them the day after that. So the only thing that can get better than the killing them all now would be something like some kind of a government funded sanctuary where you decide if you figure out a way to like rewild them, you can essentially have a piece of land that they just all go to, and whoever make it, and whoever don't. Or you put them all on this land, spay and neuter them all, and then they won't procreate. They can just live out their lives how they do. People can come and speculate if they want from afar, not in a zoo form, but just from beyond the fence. And then all these domesticated animals would just uh, be
Sort of
gone
die
and,
off
and,
as
and
a
go.
species, but not necessarily die off individually. Like, yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah, because I don't believe in ownership of sentient beings. Basically, if
Yeah.
something can perceive, if it can feel, be harmed, I don't believe in ownership. But when it's necessary, if there's an argument for it, then in that case, I just go for the best rights I can find. Like insects are sentient, but I'm never going to be able to make it to where they're not going to be smashed in the bumper of a car when you're driving down the street. So we have to do what we can do, and we can do a lot more now than we could have done hundreds of years ago. If like I try to tell people right away, so there's no tricks or anything. If I was on an island and there were chickens, I would kill the chickens. I would eat them. But now I have grocery stores. I can go eat all this different food. I can do the math. I can read all the studies to see what's healthy, and then I can go, okay, I don't need to harm this because I'm at this level of leisure. Okay, let me bring in an example. I wanna move from the alien and human one to human and human. Let's say me and you and a group of people we're going off to the we're going off. I just forgot what it's called. We go into the rainforest. And we find this tribe of people that nobody knew about, and there's like let's say 1,000 people, and they all have inbred so much that they become unable to rationalize and really to reason well at all. We can't teach them any language. They can't communicate with us in any way, but they're humans in every aspect. Like they are humans. They are of the human species, but they've just inbred so much that now they're just this wild, crazy. It's essentially like a tribe of a thousand chimps, except they happen to actually be human, but they're just anyways. And so we decide like, okay, we're gonna bring them back with us, and we're gonna make them our kind of like human versions of pets. If you want one as a pet, or you could have it as a human version of something to raise for food. If you have room in your house, if you have a certain room, you can put it in there, slide food under the door, do whatever you do. Um, Now, are there any, if this was really happening, are there any levels of humane treatment or good raising of these humans that you think would make it acceptable for us to do this?
No, but the one thing that's different in that scenario is that would be more like taking wild animals out of their already, established,
Mhm.
because the thing is, because I understand what you're saying, but I mean, I don't go in with the species bias. So for example, I mean, one of the
Okay.
reasons why I think animals have a right to rights is because I don't think that being human gives us some kind of speciality. um but when we're dealing with animals, or when we're dealing with people below a certain cognitive understanding, then we do kind of assume a right to make decisions for them, because we say, well, they can't make these decisions themselves. Now,
Yeah.
but the problem is like the reason why the example you just given doesn't work as a correlation to like the farming example is because in that scenario, that's taking like that would be like the equivalent to taking wild animals, which I don't think we have a right to do.
Okay.
So I don't think like we have a right to kidnap the tribe of people, but I also don't think we would have a right to kidnap a tribe of apes and put
Gotcha.
them in a
Okay.
zoo or
So that
whatever, because
so
they've already got their natural life.
Okay, so the wild animals that we turned into domesticated animals, you think that, well, I guess you probably don't think that was wrong to have done in the first place, because depending on the situation, if it was for survival, maybe it wasn't wrong in the first place. But the act of it itself, like right now, if we had chickens and cows, let's say we had chickens and pigs, but we didn't have cows, and to get cows, I don't know what cows were bred down from, but I don't know. Imagine we had to go find wild buffalo or wild what's a water buffalo. Yeah, and you had to bring them and then figure out a way to domesticate them and eventually form them into what we have as cows or whatever. You're saying this act would be bad. We currently, because of the abundance we have, we shouldn't go and get a wild animal to create the next domesticated animal, because we don't even have to imagine no cows. So we have cows, pigs, and chickens, but we could essentially maybe go and get another wild animal and make another thing that is what people think of as one of their meat options. But you're saying, let's not do this because right now this action would be immoral. But when the ones are already domesticated, it doesn't matter. The reason I find the problem with this is because I tried to create a scenario where these wild ones essentially are like they are domesticated. So we can even imagine. So the only difference is location. So it would be almost as if somebody stole somebody's cows and they took them into the rainforest and left them there. And eventually, some wild animals are just going to kill them because they're dumb domesticated farm animals that have no instincts for survival, probably, and so they'll get killed off. But let's say they don't get killed off. So let's say some farm animals from some other country, like some countries eat goats and some don't. So let's say the country that eats goats takes their domesticated goats to the rainforest and drops them off, and then me and you in a group are going and we go, oh, we found these. Um, Somehow we know that they are domesticated, but they're in the wild, and we can bring them back. Let's say I lived in England with you, and or in the UK with you, and let's say that there are no goats in the UK. Would it be immoral for us to bring these goats to the UK and to start breeding them, and then now there are more goats and the population of the UK eats them?
The part that made that hard to answer was the fact that they are already domesticated goats that someone just dropped off in the wild, as opposed
Yeah.
to wild goats that we're taking. So I've got to admit, I don't have a firm black and white answer to that in my head,
Okay, that's
ready to
fine.
fire
Well,
off.
my follow up question, no matter how you answered that, was going to be let's figure out what the difference between the domesticated ones and, let's say, the wild humans are. Now, I know the difference between like a wild lion and a domesticated cow. There's various different things. But there are reasons why some people, like, very few people, but some people can have like a pet monkey or something. And but I don't know what you have to do to get this license. I don't know. But anyways, and I think it's because the capability of it being a pet. People have pet parrots, but they don't have pet parrots because we've domesticated them. I don't think. I think they have pet parrots because out of all the animals in the wild, there are certain ones that we can make be friendly, and ones we can't. And so I guess separate from our current laws, we would just have to figure out what is the trait, I guess. But if we went out to an animal that was like a ruminant type animal, like a cow or a deer or whatever, like deer, the reason why it's probably not best to have deer is it because they run fast? I don't know. I don't know why deer currently aren't in areas like cows are. I don't know if there's a reason why people don't farm deer the way they farm cows. But what if you removed any trait for why you don't? Um, it can't. I don't think it can be because it's in the wild. It could be because you think that if it can survive in the wild, if it's natural to the wild, then it probably has an interest in attempting to live its own life there, where a domesticated animal wouldn't have that interest. And that's the only
Well,
thing I can imagine.
yeah, I mean, well, I suppose from my point of view, it would be that you can't. It would be very difficult to make the case for implicit consent from kidnapping a wild animal from its habitat that it's already living its life in, and taking it
Yeah.
into captivity. Now, like for example, with people that have, say, exotic pets, like if you had, like, say, someone had like a pet monkey and it had a pretty decent life, and you say, well, is that right or wrong? I'd be like, well, where did he get the monkey from? If you rescued it from, say, some lab or something, then he's rescued it from a much worse life, and
Yeah.
that monkey may not really be able to survive in the wild now because it's already been brought up into a different world or whatever. So
Mhm.
continued domestication, but with someone that actually loves it and will be a guardian for it rather than an abuser, then you can make the argument for implicit consent. But taking that same monkey from its natural environment, stealing
Mhm.
it from the wild, that's more like an abduction or a
Mm.
kidnapping, and then all of a sudden you can't really make the argument for implicit consent. I mean, the thing with like the deer versus the cow thing, a deer is a wild animal. So again, it's much
Mhm.
harder to make the implicit contract argument that, oh, well, this deer would be much happier, in on my farm than it would be out in the wild. It's like, well, there's nothing you can offer it that it's not getting from its natural world, and you're taking it
Mhm.
from its life that it's already got. But in the case of the cows, these aren't wild animals. These are animals that are bred by us. They wouldn't really survive in the wild, or certainly probably
Mhm.
not. So like those are the things that are different for me. So like if we come from it, because I agree with you about animal, we shouldn't own sentient beings, and that
Mhm.
goes down the line with the animals. But it's for me like what we call our animal. Like for example, my dog in society, my dog is considered my dog, and there is an ownership implied there.
Mhm.
But in my mind, I am the guardian of my dog, like I am the
Mm.
guardian of my child. And I don't own my dog like property. I have a duty of care, because which I've voluntarily chosen to take upon myself, to invite this dog into my home, adopt it, and be a guardian. But that dog still has rights as far as I'm concerned. And this goes with all of these animals. Now,
Mhm.
even this would even happen with the farming thing. So, if you're doing farming, let's you know, say for argument's sake that there is a standard of farming that would meet standard for implicit contract, then we're still treating this animal as a sentient being. We're not claiming ownership. We're saying no, we're acting as guardians for you as part of this implicit contract where we're getting something in return. We are going to
Mhm.
kill you at the end of it, but we're giving you a life worth living before that. We're going to kill you in a way that we consider humane. And as far as we're concerned, you're living the best life you could live, because you
Yeah.
couldn't live a life like this in the wild. But the problem is with the examples you gave of like taking, the wild animal, is that's a different scenario. You can't make the argument, all the arguments that you have for implicit consent with regards to farm animals and animals that we've already created through domestication.
Mhm.
It's very difficult to make that implicit
Yeah.
consent argument with a wild animal, you know?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree, and I think the question would come down to, is it moral to keep breeding them? So I figured out the best way to bring in my hypothetical with the humans from the rainforest. So let's say 1,000 years ago, somebody went and got the humans from the rainforest, and they were living in an area. We'll say it's in the UK, but it's in this like hidden area. They had this basically a huge piece of land that they bought and they can keep the government out of. And so for the past 1,000 years, they took this tribe from the rainforest and now they're just inbreeding them for 1,000 years. Maybe they specifically selectively breed them to be taller and stronger, but they're the same ones I described, where they're unintelligent and they're domesticated and they're yeah. Anyways, and so now this gets found out and we go, okay, we can claim that it was very immoral when it happened, but now they're here, they're domesticated, and a bunch of people in England now they want their own, they want to breed them. Is this not okay anymore? And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to get you in a trap. I'm honestly just curious about your thoughts, and I like to be challenged too. This is not a speciesist thing, because we should be speciesist. I care more about humans than animals by far. If there's a dog and a human in a burning building, I save the human. Um, and I've actually been challenged in a certain sense where if I was out in nature, um, somebody challenged me to the point where I essentially said that somebody could be mentally challenged enough to, in nature without laws, if I witnessed a killing of a mentally challenged person, I would probably let that slide, where I wouldn't if it was a non-mentally challenged person. So I think there's plenty of room to look at things like this and to figure out why we feel how we feel. But anyways, so in this situation, how strongly would you be okay with it or stand against people that want to keep breeding these inbred humans that will keep being unintelligent and unable to be reasoned with, but they have exact human emotions that we have? They can imagine the future, they can have their memories of the past, but they cannot communicate. And in many areas, they're very dumb.
I think you could do it with implicit consent. I mean, it's a little bit of a kind of grey area. It's not something that's sort of super black and white because of the various aspects of it that you described. As I say, it's like, for me, it's definitely wrong if you took them from their wild. That part's definitely wrong.
Okay.
But once they've already been taken from that scenario, then again, it's a little bit like the chimp situation again. It's like, you shouldn't take the chimp from the wild, but if you're rescuing that chimp from some laboratory or circus or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
then you're definitely doing right. And then it's like, okay, well, what about breeding in captivity? I think if you can meet the requirements for implicit consent, then, although it's one of those grey areas where I think reasonable people could disagree, I don't think it's a black and white thing. I don't think I couldn't step in and say, no, you're definitely causing a violation here by continuing to breed in captivity. I
Okay.
don't think that's necessary. I don't think I could say for certain that that's wrong. So I don't think I could be able to stop that. But I would be able to stop them poaching them from the wild, because that I can be more certain about.
Okay.
And this is again where that reason beyond reasonable doubt comes into it when it comes to enforcing law, because you need to be certain that someone's in violation. You can't just be, if it's grey area,
Yeah.
then you can't act.
Okay, well, so let's look at different areas. Let's imagine that these humans I'm talking about, people just want to use as pets. They want to use. Some people have dogs. Some people want a human pet, and so they have them in their house. And now the alternative to this could be something, because they wouldn't be able to live on their own. it wouldn't be morally right to put them back in the wild. So, what would have to happen with these humans, aside from euthanizing them, would be maybe something similar to what we currently do with extremely mentally challenged people, where they live in a home of sorts and are taken care of. So that's the alternative. But we got to decide if we are accepting of this idea of keeping these mentally challenged people as pets. So some people might have one of these pets that it's a human. They act just like humans, except you can't communicate with them, and they take them outside and run around with them. They're smiling, and everything's fine. You have a good pet owner. But then you might have one that has a human, and it just doesn't have time for it. It's at work, and while it's at work, it has to stay in this tiny backyard or in this tiny room, going to the bathroom in the corner, all this different stuff. This mentally challenged person is constantly trying to get out, as you might imagine, like a dog might want to get out of a certain room, and you can only do your best as a pet owner. So, would you find this acceptable as being owned as a pet?
You would have to well, yes and no, and let me explain.
Okay.
Because I would say yes in the sense of being an equivalent to the pet relationship that I described, like with my dog, but
Mm-hmm.
no in the sense that like like how society currently views my relationship with my dog is not how I view it, and it's not how it should be. Because as I say, I'm my dog's guardian. I'm not my dog's owner. My dog is not property. It's a sentient being, and I'm the guardian of it. Just the same as I'm the guardian of my child, my human child. You know
Okay.
that. So it would be a similar kind of scenario in what you're talking about, because and to be honest, it's almost what you're describing is almost what we have now with mentally handicapped humans that do exist. Is that if we accept that they don't possess the understanding to be able to look after themselves, just like children below a certain age and just like animals, then we have to adopt a responsibility on their behalf as their guardians. That doesn't
Hmm.
make us property owners of them. That makes us their guardians. That so we're not making them property. We're not denying their rights as sentient beings. We're simply understanding that there's certain aspects of their self ownership that they cannot exercise because they don't have the understanding to make the necessary choices. So
Would
they need a guardian that can do that on their behalf.
would
Does that
you
make sense?
be? It does. Would you be
Mm.
concerned if people were able to just go into a facility where there's mentally challenged people and say like, "Oh yeah, I want to adopt this one," and they they take a mentally challenged adult home and they just have complete guardianship over that one? The same in the same way you would a dog, where or do you think they should change how it is with dogs, where there should be checkups every like 6 months to make sure an owner is treating their dog well?
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. I mean, like I say, when I say I think it can work similar to like the relationship between a dog or a cat or another animal, but that's not in the sense of how pet ownership works today.
Yeah.
It's how I think it should work, where it's not even ownership, it's actually guardianship, similar to how we have with our children and what have you. So it's kind of like, because the thing is like, because when you said about, oh, would it be ethical for them to breed? It's like that's kind of similar to the question of if you have mentally handicapped people, or if like people that carry the genes, like for example, there's certain um, genetic conditions that can be detectable in a womb or what have you, or even before, where they say, oh, well, your child's likely to have this handicap. Is it ethical to bring them into the world and all the rest of it? And then
Mm.
but then you have the same conversation about quality of life and implicit consent. But this is my point about it. On all of this is I think it always needs to come back, because every time, if you always bring it back to self-ownership, then the questions you have to ask to make these decisions are always the same thing. Like, can I meet the
Mm.
burden of implicit consent to be able to act on behalf of this sentient being and make this
Hmm.
decision before them? If I'm making a decision that I know is just going to cause them torturous harm, then I'm obviously not meeting the burden of implicit consent. If I am making a decision that does, and if it's a grey area, then obviously that comes into the aspect of who has the authority over that grey area. So for example, to take the example of the chimp that I rescued from the circus. So in
Hmm.
that case, I've met the implicit consent because I'm providing it with a decent life. it can't go into the wild. It was raised in a circus, but I've rescued it from a worse place. So the implicit
Mm.
consent, is clearly there. Okay, but what if do I let that chimp breed with another chimp that's got a similar situation, and we create this new domesticated lineage of chimpanzees that are now
Mm.
living domesticated? I think it's kind of a moral grey area, but it's enough of a moral grey area that I don't think anybody could say that I'm clearly violating
Mm.
the implicit contract. Again, as long as I'm
Yeah,
still meeting the implicit contract with
I
each
pers
life I bring
yeah,
into
I
the world,
personally don't find it a moral gray area, but you might be. Yeah, we might have to look at each individual life. Okay, so I got a couple questions that I know the answer to, and the main questions will be the follow ups to it. So just bear with me. So going back real quick to the domesticated humans that we're having as pets, and we're okay. Should this domesticated human pet owner be able to have sex with that pet?
No,
Okay. And should a owner of a dog be able to have sex with a dog?
no,
Okay, good. Should the owner of a cow be able to have sex with a cow?
no.
Okay. So similar. So now let's look at the domesticated human not being a domesticated human pet. Let's say they're domesticated to be raised, given this good life, and then killed for food. Okay. So if you can raise this thing, give it a good life, and then the most humane killing it for food, you just give it a quick little shot, little poke, and then it drifts out. And we should probably start doing that to cows, actually. Um, but okay. So you can own this thing, you can kill it. Later, you can eat it, but the eating doesn't really matter. But you can kill it.
Sorry,
Yeah, yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but you can't own it.
Oh, you can't
Remember,
own it.
the implicit contract is
You can be
part
the
of an
guardian. You
agreement.
can be the
Yeah.
guardian of it. There is a range of good life it must have, and that range does not involve unconsensual sex. But you can kill it. Can you have sex with it after you kill it?
I guess that would be a grey area. Um, uh,
I like that you're
the
willing to
vi-
think to this level. Most people would
yeah,
just have
yeah.
their intuition jump in, but no, you're right to think about this.
Well,
It's
yeah,
kind of
because
like
I'm trying to work
roadkill.
from the principle.
Yeah, a lot of vegans that are more philosophical that like to break it down and think about it discuss roadkill and how eating roadkill wouldn't violate veganism, where other people just have their intuition, which is a go-to no you don't, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with an intuition. I don't mean anything against anybody that doesn't think philosophically, but I like that you do, and I like that you're thinking about this. So yeah, can you so you have a pet human, you're very attracted to this human, you give it a great life, you execute it because you're going to eat this human's meat like you would a cow. Yeah, can you have sex with it?
I think you probably could. I mean, it's not a practice I'm obviously endorsing, but I think I think, yeah. I mean, well, because the thing is, it's an easy answer when you're talking about the sex while they're alive, because it's rape if you're having unconsensual
Yeah.
sex, and obviously they're not able to consent. Same with children, same with your dog, same
And
with
you're
your cow.
consistent because even with farm animals, you don't want them treated poorly at all. So it's good. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's consistent.
yeah, and the thing is also, and just to put a pin in this, because I'm not trying to avoid it, but one thing of what you mentioned earlier with the species bias and that is, personally, I do reject species bias, at least with regards to the arbitrary nature of it, because like when you said, oh, you'd rescue a person before you'd rescue a dog in a burning building.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it would depend on the person and the dog, because if
Mm.
it's my dog and some person who I know is a very, let's say, not nice person, I probably wouldn't even rescue the person. I'm probably not even going to
Yeah.
rescue, you know what I mean? Even without the choice of my dog, but I certainly would choose my dog ahead of
If
them,
you
you know?
remove
So
emotions, though, what would you rescue? If you had a mentally challenged person that was severely mentally challenged that could never take care of themselves versus a very healthy 5-year-old dog that you've never met?
uh, um, I
And
suppose it
and
would
neither
depend.
would have pain. We're just talking about which one's life you save.
Okay.
Whichever one dies is just their Thanos snapped out of existence.
I suppose it would depend on the the nature of the mentally handicapped person to the degree of how deteriorated their life is. So I might view the dog's life as more valuable if the person's life is a pretty miserable, low sentient one because they're not really intellectually there and they're suffering because of whatever. Then the dog might have a better life and might be
Mhm.
more worth.
Yeah.
I mean, the point I make about saving my dog rather than the person kind of thing
Hmm.
is, yes, I understand that that doesn't mean the dog's life is objectively worth more than the person's. It's just more important to me. But the point I'm making is that's because, but that is an arbitrary preference. That's, like
Hmm.
I would rescue my own mother before I'd rescue yours.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean I've got no affection for your mother, but I care for mine more. But that doesn't mean that I understand that you would make the completely converse decision
Yeah. Yeah.
but I understand that both our decisions would be arbitrary. It wouldn't be
Mhm.
based on a principle or any kind of real moral ranking. It would just be our own emotional connection, to that person, which is, like I say, it's arbitrary and it's subjective to us.
Yeah.
So if you were taking it from a completely cold point of view, where you've got no emotional attachment to either subject, then, like, generally speaking, I can understand the argument of saying, well, we'd save the human before the animal. But if you're going to then um, add things to the human situation that then make it more equivalent to the animal, and maybe even bring it below it with regards to moral consideration, with regards to what they're actually aware of and understanding. Because one of the reasons why most people feel it's right to put this kind of moral hierarchy of rights with regards to animals is because of our intellectual awareness and our capacity to suffer. And we
Mhm.
understand that, say, for example, we're more indifferent to a dead ant than we are a dead dog, because we understand that the dog's capacity to suffer, at least as much as we can understand these things,
Mhm.
is far greater than that of the ants. So we
Yeah.
see that there's greater immorality there. And we would then extend, and most people would then extend the same argument to a human and say, well, okay, well, a human's life is worth more because they can suffer even more than a dog does, and etc. But my
Yeah.
point is yeah, but if you can take you, there's an overlap. This is one of the problems I have with a lot of people who argue against animal rights, and they do it what seems to be from a species bias, because they'll often assert, oh well, we have an intellectual superiority or whatever, and that's where the
Mm.
justification is. That's why it's not arbitrary. But then I say, okay, well, what about humans? Because there's an overlap.
Yeah.
There's like a pig. An adult pig is intellectually about level with a human below the age of 2 or 3 years old.
Yeah.
Chimps, apes can go much higher in when it comes to human equivalent age. I know,
Hmm.
even a crow can outsmart an 8-year-old in cognitive tests. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? So it's like,
Octopus are
the,
really high.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And obviously we all know about dolphins and whales and orcas and all of that. So if we were to do that intellectual hierarchy, that wouldn't
Hmm.
necessarily separate all of humanity from all of the rest of the animal kingdom. There's actually a
Yeah.
crossover there. And my point is I'm not saying that as an excuse to treat humans below a certain age or below a certain cognitive ability badly. I'm actually saying, no, what we need to do is elevate our respect for the rest of the species on this planet,
Hmm.
because our species bias that we have, a lot of it is very arbitrary. And although there's a more objective things we can point to, certainly the most intelligent humans, and most humans are obviously more intelligent than other animals, at their full development. Although there's obviously different types of intelligence as well, which murkies the waters of that conversation even more. But my point is there's enough crossover there, and it's not about is the life, because the problem is we can get into the sort of thing is, okay, well, what if you've got the life of two people and one of their IQ is 140 and the other one is 60?
Hmm.
Whose life are you saving? It's like, well, is that your only consideration? And I don't think it should be,
Yeah.
or is.
I actually
So
just recently had a conversation on this whole thing, deciding which animals, like why to value one animal over another, and which element of sentience matters. We ended up landing on, or at least I did, that I don't care about the intelligence itself. A pig being more intelligent than cat. It doesn't make me care more about the pig than the cat. Well, the thing that makes me care about sentience mostly is the ability to suffer, and then also the ability to perceive and maybe want to exist is factored in as well. But the ability to suffer and to be made to suffer is my biggest concern. But I want to bring it back real quick. Real quick for anybody still listening that thought this man sounds crazy for saying that you can have sex with the mentally challenged human pet after you kill them to eat them. I don't, that specific element, I actually don't disagree with. If somebody found roadkill, like a deer, and they had sex with its body, I would think there's probably something wrong with this person. I would think they should be on a list to keep an eye out for them. But I have no personal care to have it legal to care about something that is not sentient, and something that is dead is not sentient. But I'm also not going to fight to make laws change to where people can take corpses of humans and do what they want with it. It's complicated. But anyways, I mostly just wanted to say, if Matt sounded crazy, it's not that crazy. Oh yeah,
and also, if I could add to that, but also there's the implicit consent problem as well, because like in the scenario where you've agreed, where you've already established that it's okay to have this, to kill this person and eat them and all the rest of it. You've kind of like, well, they've already agreed to that, and then after they're dead, it's not even them anymore. It's just what you've already agreed to get. So what you do with it, whether you eat it, fuck it, whatever, it's kind of irrelevant. But in the scenario of grave robbing,
to eat it.
Say again, sorry.
Like to say, okay, if we can already eat it, then yeah, I guess we might as well be able to sleep with it once it's dead. You could say that now you don't think we should be able to eat it. That's one route you could go.
What do you mean? Sorry.
Like if you were saying that since we accept that we're going to eat it, we might as well be able to have sex with it. I was saying that you don't have to have that stance. You could say that that in your mind that the law in the UK should say, okay, legally you can't own this mentally challenged human. Because as of right now, you're thinking maybe you can own it. I was just pointing out that yes,
okay, yeah.
I
suppose from the way I'm conceptualizing it is I suppose I'm saying is like with, and similar to the implicit contract that you're doing with the farm animal, you're basically saying, okay, in exchange for a well-lived life, I'm going to kill you and eat you. But I'm not really eating you. I'm eating the meat that was once your body, but you're not here anymore. You're dead, So whether I eat you or do anything else with you, it's not you really. It's, so that's kind of part of my justification on that, if you like.
Gotcha.
Whereas if you were grave robbing, for example, you can't really make the implicit consent argument because you haven't made some contract with that person. I mean, let's put it this way. You could. I mean, let's put it this way. You could say to me, okay, Matt, I'll do a deal with you. I'll give you £1 million now, and then after you're dead, you let me do what I want with your dead body. I might say, okay, because it's not me. It's the body that used to house me, that I used to experience my life through, but I'm gone. And I've already, so there are, but like I say, that's why it wouldn't work with regards to sort of grave robbing and doing that sort of thing. So
what just real quick, because my mind just goes to random places and I like to hear people's thoughts on wild conversations that should probably never happen. Okay. So you can't sleep with the mentally challenged human pet before it's dead, but you can kill it for its meat, and you can sleep with it as much as you want until you butcher it or whatever. Could you put it in a medically induced coma and sleep with it as long as you're not going to bring it back out of the coma? And then you're going to kill it.
I am leaning towards no, but the reason why I'm finding it hard to give a definitive answer is because there's too much mystery around.
Well, because there's no suffering, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't be. Now you can be violating its rights as far as what somebody might view as a right, but as what clearly, if you are able to be the guardian of this thing, its rights are different from what we view our human rights. So you would have to say it can't have the right to not be. For you to decide I'm putting it in this room or this room, like you have the ability to fence it in, you have the ability to move it. You probably can't bruise it, you can't make it suffer, you can't, there's probably a handful of regulations that would go in place as far as your stance on it. But putting it in a coma, yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a difficult one.
Don't worry about answering that. Just keep that in your
Yeah.
head and realize that my brain's weird. Somebody in the comments said something that made me think of a separate question because they were talking about dairy cows. With these mentally challenged human pets that you are pets but also could be eaten, if it's a female, can you humanely get it pregnant, therefore it'll be lactating so you could pump it for its milk to drink? Or in your world, would you say that even though you want to keep eating meat and you think others should be able to, you think that in a perfect world there would be no dairy due to the process of getting dairy?
I'm not an expert on the process of getting dairy, although I've heard some horrific things.
Okay. Well, let's just go over it with the hypothetical of human then. So this mentally challenged human that is in this world, somebody has it as a pet. They can get it. They can, in the same way that you would breed more of these mentally challenged humans, you get them pregnant. So now they're lactating. In this case, you'd humanely have to take their baby away once they give birth to it, and then they would probably kill that baby to not get the milk, and you'd call it some form of veal. I don't know if you're familiar. Veal means it's a calf.
Veal is something that would fail the implicit contract thing, and what you're talking about with the humans would as well, from what you're saying as well.
Okay, so no milk from humans.
I guess not. I mean, if it cannot be, if that's what's involved, and that's the only way to do it, then yeah. I mean, that's
okay. Let's say they produce double the amount of milk, so that they produce twice as much as they need for a baby. So you get it pregnant, they have the baby. Let's remove the element of getting the baby and turning it into human veal. That mom keeps its baby, nurses its baby, but in between nursing, you can pump that human pet for milk.
That's a different scenario. I mean, just to give a sort of equivalent, I mean, I know some people that have chickens for eggs. Now, those chickens are very much their pets in the good sense of being considered, being loved by the family and treated well and all the rest of it. But they also get eggs out of them in the deal. Now, for me, that's a perfect example of implicit consent working almost idyllically, because the chickens are living a good life. And as far as I'm aware, there's no harm being done to them. They're not being like the things involved, like with the dairy cow example, there's nothing like that. Well,
there's nothing physical. If the egg falls out, you take the egg, so you're not physically touching it. So let's say that, because you're comparing it to the egg thing. So so the baby's getting half the milk, but the other milk will either go to waste, it'll just like dry up or just not be needed, or the owner of that pet human could take it. Could you drink it from the breast?
Could you drink it from the breast?
I'd imagine that would be, if you were being gentle and not doing some weird sexual thing, it would probably be more humane than hooking up like a machine to pump your human pet.
I guess so. I mean, it's all getting very kind of weird, and the stuff that I wouldn't want to associate with people that did this kind of thing. But
weird. The fact that we're having to think it over means there must be something at least mildly wrong with it, but maybe not. We do have to separate what feels wrong versus what is wrong. But I think maybe the physical contact is what makes it way different than the egg laying. If a chicken laid so I'm vegan. if a chicken laid an egg in the forest and I knew hypothetically that chicken was not going to come back and it took off, I would have nothing against eating that egg if I knew that it wasn't fertilized, there's no rooster involved,
Yeah.
whatever. And even then, even if it was, knowing that it hasn't reached any level of sentience or anything, there's a chance I might use that because I'm not violating anything that I view as violating. Hooking a pump up to a human woman's breast and pumping out her milk for myself or hooking myself up to her breast, I do see an issue there. And it's because of the physical contact. But it's all right for you not to. So the physical contact doesn't affect it. You have a dog, you said. If your dog had extra milk, I don't know if your dog's a lady, but let's say it was a lady and it gave birth. And let's say all the babies died, the dog babies died right away. Would you say that if they figured out a contraption that you could hook up to the dog to pump the dog milk, that would be fine to do?
Um, it potentially could be. There's one set distinction I do want to make between, like I say, because there's the moral subjectivity of what I would personally like have a problem with or find wrong according to my own ideals, and then there's what's wrong in according to the principles that I've laid out. So, like there's a lot of things that aren't objectively crimes and people have the right to do, but I don't agree with it on a more kind of personal subjective level. So like with regards to like these examples you're giving me, I'm really trying to think about whether it's violating this principle as to whether I would have a kind of more personal subjective moral problem with it, in the sense that I might not want to associate with people like that or something like that, So
Okay.
there is that
So
distinction.
let's say I guess it would have to be a government of sorts. But let's say the government put in this new stance that any pregnant woman in the UK, once they give birth, they have to show up at a certain time once a week to donate some of their breast milk. I'm guessing your answer is no. Is the difference between that and the pet human that's unintelligent just
Well, yeah,
because they were
because
domesticated 1,000 years ago? What's the difference there?
well, no, the difference is you can't use implicit consent to override explicit consent. The whole point of implicit consent is because you cannot obtain explicit consent. So,
Fair
like
enough, yeah.
with regard, like my argument for why I can bring my child into into this world without his explicit consent is there's no way for me to get that. Like if
Okay.
I push someone out of the way of an oncoming bus, I'm doing that with implicit consent because I can't. There's no time to get explicit consent, so
Okay.
I'm acting with him. But if that person turned around to me and says, "No, this is part of a movie. Leave me alone. I'm going to get hit by a bus as a stuntman or something," then you know what I mean. So it's like with the
Yeah.
example with the government forcing women. No, because the women they're capable of expressing their consent, because this is the thing with the rights thing. It's not that I feel like there's less rights in the right sense, it's just less ability to express their consent, which is why we then have to step in with implicit consent. But implicit consent is only for when explicit consent is unobtainable.
Okay. So we have these pet human, unintelligent humans that I keep rephrasing that because I keep seeing more people showing up to the live stream. So people have no idea what we're talking about. But okay, so you can breed these unintelligent pet humans. You can breed more of them because you sell them off for pets, but also you're going to butcher them for food later and maybe have sex with their dead body before you butcher them. But let's say, so we already said that in this world where you find this acceptable, you don't find it acceptable to have sex with them before they're dead. What if you do anyway? So what if instead of normally breeding them, what if you decide to and you get one of these ones pregnant? Its baby is half intelligent and half, and so yeah, how would this play out? Would there be a certain amount of intelligence needed for them to say, oh, that baby that shouldn't have been made because that guy did this illegal thing, we need to add that to the UK's citizen community, even though it's going to have some issues because it came from one of these human pets, and then you'll probably get in trouble. But yeah.
Yeah, just, and again, for the benefit of people just joining this conversation, we are redefining pets really with regards to guardianship over ownership in the
Yeah, that's
context
right.
of
Yeah.
these human pets. So, I mean, and again, the thing is though, it's the same with we've kind of already got this standard with mentally handicapped humans that exist now and children,
Mhm.
and like it's not about like so like in the example you gave, you've got this mentally handicapped person, and then you slept with them, which is essentially rape because
Mhm.
they can't consent, and then you've made them pregnant. Now, we don't necessarily abort children just because they're the product of rape. It's not the child's fault. Now,
Mhm.
if that child is born, it would kind of depend. Is the child if the child develops into a being that's like you and cognitively capable of taking the full self ownership and making its own decisions and what have you, then that right will eventually be afforded to it once it reaches that point. If it
Okay.
doesn't, then obviously it will never exercise that. Just like there are mentally handicapped adults now who are still looked after by a carer because they can't look after themselves, and
Mhm.
again, people have to act with implicit consent with regards to the decisions they make on their behalf. So it would just be the same, really. I mean, I know we're going into kind of weird and wonderful scenarios, with regards to like these people, but there are kind of somewhat equivalents that we have today with regards to like I say, how we treat mentally handicapped people and how we view it's not about them not having the right to consent, it's about them just not having the cognitive ability to because
Yeah.
consent requires understanding. That's why we say children can't consent to sex. They
Yeah.
don't understand what they're consenting to,
Well, yeah,
so
then we have to figure out if you don't have the ability to consent, then what is it reasonable to do with such a being, considering that they're sentient? So I guess what I want to figure out now, so we because I don't view the examples I brought up of what we are accepting as human pets as much different than probably the most severe mentally challenged people. So there could be argument that now that this exists, that people discovered these people that were inbred so much that they're these challenged pets. They've been breeding them for 1,000 years. It could be argued that there might be 4 or 5 people that were already in the real world. In a facility being watched over, that it's like, oh, you might as well add them to the group. And so the same thing could be argued that these remaining ones, we don't breed them any further. We don't let people own them as pets or eat these humans. We just have them watched over from like government programs until they die out. Now that would seem like the more moral thing to me. But since you do accept, with your logic on this, you do accept a world where these humans could be pets. What would have to happen? What would we have to add to the humans' abilities to make it to where you would say, okay, now they're in the mentally challenged housing? Because I don't want to add enough to make them just normal people. I want to figure out what they need to do for you to go, okay, these people should be looked over by the government. We should try to encourage or maybe even force no more reproduction of them. But we're not going to let random people be guardians of them and eat them.
right, okay, yeah. I mean, yeah, but the thing is I mean, because like you say, well, like this is the problem with describing them as pets, because again we need to redefine what pets are, because that
Hmm.
I'm not saying that it's okay to have them
Well,
as
you just say
pets in the
human
sense.
companion, like this kind of challenged human. Now we can't know for sure because, as you've probably seen with dogs, some dogs are rowdy and they don't like their owners, and if they're put in a certain room, they'll scratch at the door. So we can assume that some of these humans would be clearly wanting out, and they want to get out of a room, and they're just freaked out, and they'd seem like a crazy person in a mental hospital. And then some might be like, you might be sitting on your couch watching TV and they set their head on your lap and you're just petting their hair. Um, so we can have a wide range, but if we're looking at them as owned like dogs,
Yeah, but
yeah.
that's my point is, sorry, and this is the clarification I
Mhm.
want to make with this pets conversation is that I don't agree with the ownership paradigm for dogs either. Like our pets
I refer to
Like,
children as owned by parents. It's just a word I use because if you have complete control, and I recently looked up the word guardian, and the word guardian's kind of specific, and it doesn't, like, a parent isn't a guardian of their child, at least by definition. So I think that's why I stopped using that word. But guardian's fine. We could say guardian. So the guardian of a
how is
human.
how is a parent not a guardian?
Yeah, it's weird, and it might just be. I think it was. If you Google a word and the definition comes up, I think it's maybe the Oxford dictionary. Whereas sometimes I look up Merriam-Webster's. Let's see, guardian. Um, yeah, I can type. What on earth, guardian? Okay, definition. Um, oh, weird. I don't know which definition I looked at, but yeah, this one now is just saying a defender, protector, and keeper. And that's Oxford. Okay, maybe I was looking at Merriam-Webster's. Anyways, I was writing something down for a book, and I remember writing guardian, and then when I looked something up, it gave me the impression that guardian would be what you refer to if you are the caretaker and not the parent. But anyways, so I guess that does fit in. But yeah, let's just say guardian.
Yeah, I suppose guardian is usually used when not referring to the parent because parent is parent. So like
It'll
sometimes you
say
want to
parent
say that.
or legal guardian, something like that.
Yeah. Because if you're not the actual parent, but you've got the equivalent role of duty of care, then they call you a guardian. But I suppose the way I view it is not all guardians are parents, but all parents are guardians. It would be a
Gotcha.
sort of simple way of saying it.
Um,
Um, so,
yeah. Well,
so yeah,
mhm.
sorry, just to go on to the pet thing though, but that's my point about the pet thing. It's like I'm only accepting this scenario of these humans being like quote unquote pets if we redefine pets in the sort of guardianship
Mhm.
paradigm that I was talking about. And I know because I don't because I don't quibble over the language like everyone says about how's your dog or is that your dog or whatever. I
Mhm.
don't go into some big thing about it's not my dog, I'm just a guardian or anything like that. But I'm just saying that because it's kind of inherent in our language now that we think of our pets almost like property. But
Yeah.
I'm just talking in a moral reality sense.
Mhm.
My pet is not my property. Like, my car is my property. My guitar is my property. My pet is a sentient being who I have guardianship over, just like my
Mhm.
child is a sentient being I have guardianship over. Now, how I came to get that guardianship over these beings is different in the different cases. Obviously, in the case of my child, I brought them into the world. So I have a duty of care over them because they can't take care of themselves. And because I'm the one who brought them into this peril, which is this world they can't survive on their own, I have a
Mhm.
duty of care, and that makes me the guardian because I own the duty of care. I have, the right of guardianship. With the dog, it's obviously different because there's an adoption rather than me actually creating them or bringing them into the world, unless
Mhm.
obviously you could have a dog and the dog has puppies and then there's an adoption process, but the same basic paradigm. So when we're talking about this other scenario of these handicapped humans who we're having as almost like pets,
Mhm.
I mean, the pets is a misleading word in the traditional sense because pets, as how I actually think of actual pets as in animals, is more of like an adoption guardianship paradigm relationship than a
Mhm.
traditional ownership
Yeah.
relationship that we normally associate with pets. So when you were talking about, oh, well, what do we do? What about these other group of humans that aren't quite the pets, but they're not quite the competent humans who can, take care of themselves and be their own guardians? I'm like,
Mhm.
well, they're the same as the pet group, but the pet group are the same as them more really. And
Yeah.
perhaps pet is a
Well,
misleading word.
let me rephrase my question. Let me double check on something real quick. So in this world, so your personal preference would be that there is very good welfare and guardianship of any domesticated animal, whether you're going to eat them or not. And the reason it's okay to end their life and then eat them after you end their life is because they were treated really well, but they are not. Their brain level is not able um, to make choices. And so a cow, you have to give it a good life. If somebody's torturing it, that would be illegal in your sense. But at whatever point they want to, as long as they humanely end its life, that somewhat the reason why it's okay, because they can't tell you, they can't communicate essentially.
Well, the reason why it's okay is because you're providing them a life which meets the standard of the implicit consent or the implicit contract that you want to invoke.
Okay.
So you're basically saying that, like, this cow can't make the agreement with me because it doesn't, it lacks the ability to do it. So I'm
Mhm.
going to use implicit contract to say that it's reasonable to assume that it would accept the terms of this agreement, which is I provide it with a life worth living and I get its meat at the end of it. And
Okay.
I can obviously end that life more humanely than it would otherwise be ended. Now, when you say, well, like I could end at any time, well, no, because you've got to meet the requirements of the implicit
Mm.
consent. So the life has got to be pleasant enough and long enough to meet the requirements of the implicit contract that you're invoking.
Would it be a percentage of that species average lifespan?
I mean, it wouldn't be it's not an exact science, just like, the difference between child abuse and just different parenting tactics
Hmm.
isn't an exact science. But the standard that you're working on would be the implicit contract. It would be the implicit consent. Um, so yeah, I mean, percentage would certainly be a factor, I think,
Let's just take a
because it,
cow. If a cow was not a dairy cow, therefore not like impregnated over and over and over again, not milked and all that kind of stuff. If you just took a cow and it was raised well, I think they live about 25 years. That assumed lifespan, does that number affect it? Like what would you choose for how long you have to wait till you can execute it?
yeah. So I would say that you, and again, this isn't an exact science, but I would say you would probably have to let it live to at least 15 if it had a natural life of 25. Now, depending on other factors, like I don't know how much it would deteriorate after a certain age and stuff like that. You could make an argue that, oh, it's only got real quality of life for the first 8 years or whatever, and then after that, it's struggling for 10 or whatever.
Mhm.
But I mean, but the underlying principle that's guiding all of these things is this implicit contract that you've got to make. So, I mean,
Mhm.
you could argue that 10 years of really good life would be better than 15 years of okay life. You know what I mean?
Mm.
So,
Mhm.
like, reasonable people could kind of debate within these lines. But if the life's not worth living because it's not pleasant and it's so short that it's not worth having, then you're clearly failing the implicit contract. Now,
Mm.
if the cow lives like 90% of what it could possibly naturally live, and it's living
Mhm.
about as good a life, then you're without question are meeting the requirements of this
Okay.
implicit contract. And there's obviously going to be a fuzzy edge in between that you're going to try and narrow down. And I think there's a lot. I don't think there's one factor. I don't think it's just how long they would have to live. It would be quality and quantity of life that I think would come into the equation of whether you, but whether you're meeting the burden. But the burden you're meeting is the implicit contract. Like it's
Okay.
not,
And the same would be with a
it's not.
dog.
Yeah, with anything, with whether I mean this is the thing, whether it's my child, whether it's my dog, or whether it's
Well,
my
not
cow.
child for the eating.
Well, no, but this is the point. Whether it's my child, whether it's my dog, or whether it's the cow, I've got
Mhm.
to meet the burden of implicit consent on
Mhm.
all of those situations. But meeting that burden is very different for the different creatures because
Yeah.
to provide a cow a life worth living is a lot different to providing my son with a life worth living.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And the
Well, let's
the
just take the dog
indignity
then.
of being eaten at the end of his life might be something that my son could quite clearly say, no, that's not that. I
Yeah.
mean, and obviously in the case of my son, he'll eventually become of an age where he can clarify his consent, and I can no longer
Where the
fall on
cat,
my implicit
where the
consent.
cow and the hypothetical mentally challenged human cannot. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, so what about a dog then? I mean, I think I know the answer. It's fine to eat the dog. So your dog, if an average lifespan of a dog is 25 years, then you give it a great life. You could take it down to the vet, have them just inject it with a thing, dog dies slowly, you take it home and do what you would do to a deer, but to your dog, just like cut it up and do your thing.
I remember just to give you a real life example, my mum had a couple of sheep once, just they were pet sheep.
Mhm.
She rescued them, and she has a horse. So she had it on the sheep on the yard with the horses. When
Mhm.
those sheep died, we buried them. We didn't eat them because it just didn't feel right. Now, we both have eaten lamb in our life. We have eaten sheep. It's not like we have an objection, but
Mhm.
because we had that, but if we had chosen to eat them, I don't think, like there's no right or wrong answer there. Our own personal kind of morality. And this is again where I like to draw the distinction between what's acceptable to me on a personal level and what's acceptable according to these principles that I'm laying out. There's obviously those aren't exactly the same thing, but you might even imagine like maybe there's people, I don't know if there are, but maybe there are cultures where people eat their dead afterwards.
Mhm.
That's fine. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Obviously in those cases, the people can express explicit consent. But
Mhm.
again, I don't see, even if it's not something that I would personally agree with on a personal level with regards to what I would want as a cultural norm, it's
Mhm.
not something I can point to as a crime. It's not something I can point to as a
Yeah.
violation.
I agree with you on the eating afterwards. Just because my moral stance has to do with sentience and not necessarily has to do with implicit contracts or ability to communicate. But I'm glad you brought up that idea of the sheep thing because it reminded me of a thought I had, and you might have a different one. But I was trying to think about because I've been having conversations. My vegan channel is kind of strange because I come up with a lot of strange ideas that a lot of people don't like the idea of. And so one thing I was talking about was if I knew that animals had no care to exist, they have no thoughts of the future. A cow's not going to say, "Hey, I'm going to hang out with my cow buddy tomorrow." They have no thoughts of the future, and they don't even care to exist. Their only actions that look like they care would be maybe instinct of survival. So if an animal's trying to hurt it, it will like do a thing like it's trying to survive. But if you could give it the ability to communicate and know English, would the extent of its understanding even know what existing is and want to exist? Where it could know grass is my favorite and oak leaves are my second favorite. Like it would know all the things it knows, but would it know to exist? And in my mind, I actually am not too concerned with the idea of something dying if it doesn't care to exist. So this is a challenge I've been bringing up to some fellow vegans. The problem is it's all hypothetical because we can't know. Animals might care to exist, but I brought it to humans though because I was wondering if a stranger, somebody I've never met, that just over here they die, and let's imagine they don't have a family or anything, so I don't have to imagine how their death affects others. And I'm trying to think like, does their death matter to me? And well, first of all, before I answer that, can you explain to me if their death matters to you, why it does? Just a random stranger. Because I could barely come up with an example myself.
Um, yeah, all sentient life matters to me,
Hmm.
because and sentient, conscious, whatever you. It's for me that it's not about how much they understand, because I've got obviously not very good many memories, but I've got some memories of when I was like very young, close to a baby, and not really understanding a lot of what was around me,
Hmm.
but understanding enough to be able to suffer, and
Yeah.
understanding enough to be afraid and and
Well,
and,
let's say there was
and
no
have.
suffering. If you just heard that somebody died today and there was no suffering and they don't have a family, what about their death? How would you describe why you don't like that?
Well, it's still the ending of their experience,
Hmm.
one of the things that we invoke with the implicit contract about bringing beings into this world is we're running on the assumption that existence is better than non-existence, life is
Hmm.
better than death, as a
Hmm.
preference for our own selves, and our ability to empathize with others should at least make us care about the experiences of others, including
Mm.
when that end comes to an end. So
Yeah.
even a painless death, I mean, a painless death is a painful suffering death is obviously worse than a painless death.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean the painless death is irrelevant. It's
Hmm.
still it's still the end of that person's life, and or that sentient being's life. So there's still cause to care there.
Yeah, yeah. The only thing I could come up with is that I want to live. I like have a lot of things I want to do. I have like all the things in the world. If somebody told me I was going to die tomorrow, I'd be super bummed out for a lot of reasons, but one of the main ones would be just all the things I want to do. So if I heard somebody died, I think the only reason I would feel any I'd feel off about that is I would assume because they are of my species, that they have that as well. They wanted to do like they might have a movie they wanted to see next week and they don't get to see it, so it feels awkward to me because I have that same connection. And it's just interesting because I think it's just a topic people don't usually think about. But I can't think of any other reason to care that they don't exist anymore. Like when you don't exist, you just don't exist. Like I'm not religious, so I don't have to think of an afterlife or anything like that. Um, but when I think of morals and I think of the idea of being able to suffer and have pleasure, I just think of how much I don't think anybody should make anything or anyone suffer. And even if something's done accidentally, I have a wild amount of empathy for somebody suffering. But being taken out of existence is probably my biggest fear, and therefore I don't like the idea of it happening to somebody else. But it's just interesting. I can't think of any other.
Well,
Probably because there is
let's put it
another
this way.
answer.
Let's put it this way. The only time we really view ending life to be justified is when the suffering is so extreme that we would then like we start on a default that existence is better than non-existence, so that life is better than death. And the only
Hmm.
way in which we would reconsider that default position is if the person was suffering so badly that we might reconsider that, and that actually maybe they'd be better off dead. Like the reason
Yeah.
why we put down our pets, for example, when they're at the end of their life and they're suffering and we feel there's no more we can do for them,
Hmm.
and the argument for euthanasia within humans, which is an argument I'm on the side of, if you like, of thinking that people have the right to,
Hmm.
um, is the fact that sometimes life can be so bad that death is better. But generally
Oh, definitely.
speaking, unless you've got that level of suffering applied, then life is better than death. Existence is better than non-existence. We work on that assumption, like you say, because of our own experience. And it's like, I mean, that's another thing as well. Is like when I think about my own experience, particularly when I was younger and I had less of an understanding, and when I look at my child and I look at my dog, or I look at another animal, I see obviously the experience isn't the same, just like the experiences from between different people isn't the same. And obviously then when you move to different species, it's going to get more different in different ways, and we perceive the world differently, we think about the world differently, we understand things differently, and obviously
Hmm.
there's a lot less understanding and stuff. But what is always there is a sentient being having an experience. And
Hmm.
certainly in the case of other mammals and most other animals of all description, there's
Hmm.
certain things that we're almost as certain as we can possibly be that they share with us, with regards to
Yeah.
fear, with regards to capacity to feel pain, suffering.
Hmm.
And if it's wrong for us to go through that, there's no real argument that I can see outside of arbitrary things like species bias for saying that it's not also wrong, to put that on these other beings. So
Mm.
for me,
Hmm.
and the reason why, like, I find all death, you know, to be like a bad thing, or something to be like, oh, that's a shame that person's died or that creature's died. I mean, when I see roadkill on the road, it makes me sad.
Yeah.
It makes me sad every time I see an animal that's died on the road, and it makes me
Hmm.
sad every time I hear about a person losing their life or suffering or whatever. Because, and for me, that's empathy that's operating there. Now, a
Hmm.
lot of people don't have a great deal of empathy, and ironically, it's those people who don't have a lot of empathy that are often very dismissive of the animal rights conversation, who will
Hmm.
often point to the lack of empathy within a lot of animals as a reason why they don't deserve our empathy. It's often the least empathetic humans that will
Yeah.
point to animals being worth less because they say they're like, I mean, I remember seeing on a program once where they would talk, someone was trying to dismiss the love uh, of this woman's cats. Like a woman had a load of cats. And he said, "Oh, well, I'm sure when you're dead, they'll just eat your body." As if that suggests that the cats don't really love you because they'll eat your body when you're dead. But from the cat's point of view, there's no reason to think that after you're dead and they're trapped in a house with no food, that you're anything other than meat at that point. That doesn't mean they didn't
Yeah.
love you. They just recognize that you aren't there anymore. And now that all that's there is some meat, a rotting carcass in a house that they're trapped in, and they're going to. I mean,
Yeah.
people eat
That's yeah.
people when they're desperate enough. So to
Yeah.
dismiss animals as not and the thing is, I've seen enough, not just in my own life, but also sort of researching the subject, to know that so many of the things that people think are uniquely human are not uniquely human, including our
Hmm.
capacity to love and feel empathy for each other. And some
Hmm.
of the selfless acts of love I've seen from animals, puts those arguments to bed.
Hmm.
Quite, beyond doubt. And I've heard people say, "Well, you don't know what an animal's thinking." So I don't know what another person's thinking. I don't even, like the one thing we say about consciousness is the only thing we're certain of is our own conscious experience. Because for all
Hmm.
we know, we're living in a simulation, and everybody else is some NPC character that's no more alive than the people we meet in our dreams.
Yeah.
Obviously, I don't believe that, but that's when we're talking about what we know for certain. But what we
Hmm.
can make a very reasonable assumption on, even though I don't know for certain that you're a conscious being the same as me, there's
Hmm.
no reason to think you're not. There's no
Yeah.
and I also say the same about animals. I say, well, there's no reason to think that my dog doesn't possess all of the things that my child possesses that matter, that make them morally relevant. There's a
Hmm.
sentient being there that can suffer, that has a right to itself, that has a right to life that's no more divine than my own. Now, there's a
Hmm.
difference between how much they can understand. There's a difference between what would be involved to give them a life worth living. There's plenty of differences between us, but none of those differences amount to a moral separation where
Yeah.
we're beings deserving of rights and they're. I mean, a lot of people literally, and I've heard people make this argument where they literally try to claim that animals are basically like biological machines. And
Hmm.
like I say, I find it funny because those are exactly the sort of humans that lack the empathy and the intellectual understanding to see that that's
Hmm.
clearly not the case. I mean, I don't see how anyone could observe the
Yeah.
world
I've
and
talked to a
look at,
handful of
you know,
people that think, like when you see a animal's negative reaction to being stabbed or something, that they aren't feeling pain; they're just reacting to stimuli, which is seems pretty absurd, and I don't think science is on their side. But here, let's bring. I got about maybe 15 minutes left. I want to. I want to test the limits of what makes something reasonable to do. So in this world where you would say the ideal world for you, at least for now, unless I can change your mind, or somebody else can, is that as long as you're giving something a better existence than it would have had, and they can't really communicate with you. That at some point there is a point where they've had a good enough life that you can end their life to eat them. Now you can end their life and also have sex with their corpse and eat them. The question now I want to bring to you is, can you end their life just to have sex with their corpse and not eat them?
yeah, I mean, again, it's not something I personally would like or agree with, but yeah, I mean, from a rights point of view, the basic idea is you're saying that, okay, in exchange for providing you with a life that you either wouldn't otherwise have at all or wouldn't be anywhere near as good as this, I am
Mhm.
going to provide you with that life and protection and what have you. And at the end of it, I want your
Okay.
dead body that you no longer inhabit. And
But you can end that life to get it. I hear
yeah,
the idea you're saying if you own a dog and then that dog lives its life out and then it dies and you want to you want to do whatever you want to its body, that's one thing. But you think the ending of existence as long as it had better than it would have otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, you've still got to meet the requirements of implicit consent. And the thing is with that is you could meet the bare minimum requirements, which I'd imagine a lot of people would do if they were going to take a cynical approach to this, or you could go above and beyond,
Mm.
and take the spirit, embody that spirit for what it's worth, and want to make sure that you're not doing the bare minimum. It's like with your children. You could have a really callous sociopathic parent who doesn't want to get in trouble, so they'll do the bare minimum of what there's required to meet their duty of care as guardian or parent of their child. But they'll do the bare minimum. They'll do no more than that. Now, most parents will embrace the spirit of their duty of care, and they want to do more than the bare minimum. They want to, do the absolute most, and often that's motivated by love, and there's selfish things like our gene propagation and all of that falls into it. But the basic facts, because when we're talking about rights and what this principle is dictating, we're basically saying you've got to meet this requirement of implicit consent. But yeah, there's a minimum level, and then there's you can go beyond there and be extra. And I mean, for example, someone used an example, because I was having a conversation about this with someone, and they were talking about, is it Kobe beef, Kobe meat, Kobe
Yeah, that
steaks, or
sounds
something like
familiar.
that.
Yeah.
It's basically, it's a type of steak that comes from a cow that's basically allowed to live for a really long time,
Mm.
treated really well. The steak is, as you may predict, relatively expensive, but it's also a very well sought after steak because the meat's considered extra good, extra tender. Because I mean, and although this isn't necessarily relevant to the rights issue, there are sort of some incentives do line up, because often, and like I know this is a side issue, but when we're talking about how practical this can work out, it is often of benefit to treat the animals we eat well, even if you ignore the ethics side of it, because our mistreatment of animals has fallen onto us with many of the illnesses and diseases we get. We pump these cows through of antibiotics because of how badly we treat them, and
Hmm.
that we end up eating the meat. And there's lots of um, there's lots of diseases and things that have come out of how we treat farm animals and stuff like that. And then the converse of it, the most sought after meats, like the expensive, considered the best meats, are the meats where the cow has lived like a absolutely luxurious life and lived to a ripe old age. And yeah,
Mm.
they're not doing it from an ethics point of view. They're doing it because they can command a high price for the meat, because the meat is considered much better for you and it's tastier and all these things.
Hmm.
But that's just a situation where um, you know other incentives line up with what would be the morally dictated course. So you could have people doing the bare minimum. Like say you had this scenario where we had the nations of sanity and the overall scenario, and that fed through to our farming practices, where there was a demand over how humane the farming was, because it had to meet this standard of implicit consent. I don't doubt you'll have plenty that will work to the absolute minimum of what is required to meet these implicit consent demands. But there's also a great deal of incentive to go above and beyond, not just from the moral point of view, with regards to sort of saying, because obviously some people, people will opt for free range eggs. I know a lot of these are mismarketed, but people opt for free range eggs because they rather, for their own conscience. But then there's also the case, like with the Kobe meat situation, where even people who don't care at all about animal rights would rather have meat that's come through these sources, because it's actually more beneficial to them as well. So there is often a marriage of incentives. It's not like the ethical choice is always in conflict with the choice that has other incentives. Often incentives line up. Not always the case, but
Hmm.
that's an example of it.
Yeah. Can you see this comment that I put up on the screen?
Um, Matt sounds more ethical and more vegan than many vegans, just like Alec O'Connor. That's so funny. They must end up vegan soon. Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, I've got a lot of respect for vegans. Um, I mean, there's many times where I feel like a bit of a hypocrite for not being a vegan, because I do, because a lot of people who eat meat will just say, I don't care about animals, or I don't care about animal rights. I do care about animals, and I do care about animal rights.
Mm.
And although I do feel on an intellectual level, as from the case I've made out with implicit consent, that there's an argument to be made it's not just about me trying to justify my meat eating, but at the same time, there is a big part of me that just wants to have no part of the meat industry, because as much as I can talk about this idyllic, humane scenario where that, where implicit contract is demanded for all farming, that's not the reality we live in at the moment. And I
Mm.
suppose one of my justifications for not being a vegan is a little bit like saying, well, I know all the suffering that's behind my iPhone, but I still use it. I know all the suffering that goes behind a lot of the things that I still use in society. And although I want to work in other ways to change those things, I'm
How well do you
unfortunately.
know each though? What suffering does go into the iPhone? Would you say?
Well, I'm not an expert on it, actually, to be fair, so perhaps I shouldn't have used that example. But I've heard
No, it's
people
fine.
give the example of like cobalt, the mining for some of the materials, like the cobalt and the lithium,
Mm.
using like third world slave labor and
Mm.
appalling work conditions. I've heard a lot of people. It's not something I've researched a great deal, so I
Yeah.
can't
No, I
speak with
haven't
great
either. Yeah.
authority on it. But but again, this is an argument that's often been put, sort of against vegans, where they say,
Mm-hmm.
oh well, you could boycott if you were going to boycott everything that had a unethical source, you
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't be able to live in this world because all the clothes you're wearing, or and it's probably not the case with but we know
Yeah.
that there's a lot of bad practices from a lot of companies that we do use,
Yeah, I
and
think the saying is there's no ethical consumption under capitalism or something like that.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, me personally, I try to not buy clothes often at all. And when I get clothes, I actually just get hand me downs and thrift shops and stuff like that. I think it's good to do the best you can. I try to make my own coffee, but if I ever forget to brew my cold brew the night before, if I go to Starbucks or something, I'll take a mug like this instead of using their plastic cups. It's good to learn as much as we can and do the best we can. The way I look at veganism is we can see the direct action. I mean, there is a link. We aren't directly killing them, but if you eat an animal, you are putting it in demand, and it's a direct link. Where
sure.
the detail that would go into making a phone and all these different things are complicated. There are probably a lot of things that somebody that goes out of their way to be a vegan should also go out of their way for. And I think us humans should constantly be having conversations like we're having to try to better the world. What I would say, and I'm curious for you, is do you go out of your way to try to get more like humanely sourced things? Like, do you get like free range eggs if you see the sign, or how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I go to massive lengths of like heavy research, because but yeah, I will choose free range or organic. Those are over
Mm.
not. But I'd be lying if I said I went to real diligent effort. Sometimes I'll walk into a shop and I'll buy it because it's what's there kind of thing,
Yeah.
and I don't research the company and find out their farming practices and stuff like that, partly
Mm.
because I'm sure I probably won't like what I find in many cases. So,
Yeah.
but given the choice, I always try to opt for that when it says free range, or when it. I mean, let's put it this way, because often this is a part of marketing for things like this. Is sometimes they'll put that as part of their marketing. That's something that works on me more than price. So I
Yeah.
will pay more for something that's promising or advertising a greater deal of humanity towards the animals, whether it's the eggs, free range eggs, or grass fed cows, or
Hmm.
this sort of situation. So yeah, I do lean to that direction. I probably could do a lot more with regards to being more diligent in that regards, but
Hmm. Yeah.
sometimes
Sometimes we
life
just
gets
need.
in its way.
Yeah. Sometimes we just need reminders. And yeah, yeah.
Another,
Yeah.
sorry,
Maybe
one
even
other
like.
thing.
Oh, go for it.
Sorry, no. Also, one other thing I just wanted to mention, though, because one thing I sort of do have a question I want to put to vegans as well is, I know you answered the question about what would we do with all the animals if the world turned vegan tomorrow, and
Hmm.
obviously your cull them all solution would be preferable to their current situation. I would ask whether it would be preferable to what I'm proposing necessarily,
Hmm.
though. Like the because it get by definition. But the other thing, question before you answer that one as well.
Hmm.
The other question I'd like is, what about like our care for animals that do need to eat meat? Like, for example, I mean, I don't know about the dog situation, but certainly cats are
Yeah.
carnivorous, and it would be
S-
very difficult to have a vegan cat, you know?
Yeah, so I don't think we humans should own animals at all. It's not a stance I take like when I'm usually telling people about veganism. In fact, usually I don't even try to turn people into vegans. I just I usually actually go the route of health, and I say like if because the main excuse I can imagine would be if somebody is convinced they need animals for health. When I talk to people about veganism, I just point out like, okay, so if you're going to eat this because you feel it's healthy, but what about like cake and hot dogs and deep fried chicken nuggets and these unhealthy things that cause animal suffering? Is their suffering worth your taste buds? Where in my mind, some suffering and death is worth health, but not taste buds. So that's usually the route I go. So I would never like want veganism to come across as you can't own pets. But in my personal opinion, I don't think sentient beings should be owned in any way. So the wild is just the wild, and humans are humans. I don't like the idea that the wild can access our civilization. I don't like that deer. I don't know if you have this problem in the UK, but roadkill here, it's usually a deer or possum. I wish we did a better job of keeping the wild out, but same thing with domesticated pets. They're either locked in our house, or if they're not locked in our house, then they have an opportunity of getting ran over. I just don't. I wish animals never got domesticated in any form, and now that they have, I wish we just removed that. Like, I wish no cat or dog was ever bred again. I don't think they should be bred anymore. And then I don't know exactly what it would look like. But yeah, I don't like, I see a moral issue, especially when you look at factory farming. If you look at the practices of what happens to pigs and cows and chickens, to put those animals, many of those animals, through that to feed a cat or a dog, I see a huge downside. Yeah.
But I'm, yeah, things I agree with that though. Like I agree that like factory farming is evil and should be stopped.
Mm.
Um, and I also agree that we shouldn't own or we shouldn't be able to own sentient beings. But obviously, I can agree with that and still think that we can have farming that isn't factory farming and that
Mhm.
has these humane standards that meet implicit contract. And I also think that we can still have pets, but with a guardianship dynamic rather than a ownership dynamic.
Yeah, and I mean the same thing. I know, I'm sure you're a great owner or guardian of your dog, and I have friends that are vegan that have dogs, and I'm sure they're great as well. I just used the word owner, but yeah. So with the guardian thing, but yeah, even if it was like I think there is something that must be wrong about taking chickens or pigs, and they have a great life. Their guardians take care of them, and then the guardians of cats take care of the cats. But then the pigs and the chickens have to have their existence wiped out to satisfy existence. I don't think that should be a human choice. If that's out in nature, I'm fine with nature taking its course. But yeah, that
But I mean,
yeah.
sorry, just to just to ask
You're
a
fine.
question. What is because like I say, when you say I don't think we should be able to own sentient beings, like I say, I do agree with that sentiment. But like I say, I
Mhm.
still think pet ownership can still exist, but in a like I say, a guardianship dynamic rather than
Mhm.
a strict ownership sense. What is your issue with the the guardianship dynamic? Like, what is the where's the wrong in that? Like for example, where's the wrong
They're
in the
trapped.
cat dog?
So like if I went, I tried to come up with a scenario of where I think it's all right to have something that looks like dog guardianship. I'll say that instead of ownership. But if I went out into the forest and I built a cabin and I had a doorway but no door, and a wild dog, a wolf of sorts that didn't want to eat me, came up and started playing with me, and we had a good time. And then when I went in the house to go to bed, it came and laid by my side, but there was a doorway and it could leave. That would be fine. I see no problem there. I'm not like enticing it to an area where it's near our man-made roads or anything, and it's not locked in anywhere. I didn't put it in a place to where there are walls or a circled wall that keeps it in there. That's the issue for me.
But in most cases, and obviously this isn't across the board, but in most cases, and certainly the case of, like, obviously my own experience with pets, in most cases, isn't that pretty much the situation? I mean, even the situations where you're locking them in, it's not because they would escape you. It's
Mhm.
just because, like, a safety thing, like you would lock you so they don't run out into the road or whatever. Like again, that's still within your sort of guardianship role. I mean, one of the
Mhm.
reasons why I asked is because when we're talking before about like taking animals from the wild, and this is where the problem happens. But once we've got them domesticated, we might as well carry on, kind of thing. The
Mhm.
other the other thing I had, and we don't know definitively how it all began, but there's a lot of suggestion that, at least to the degree that it can be, that the dog and cat domestication was not necessarily just our decision. Like, there's a lot of
Mhm.
suggestion that it came from wolves coming close to tribes of people, maybe wolves that were outcasted or whatever, and
Mhm.
and being fed by us and slowly, slowly becoming, and certainly, I mean, again, this isn't the true with all, but certainly a lot of cats, if they didn't want to be with their owner, they, because often they go wandering, and there's certainly lots of evidence of choice, at least to the degree that choice can be understood and made by the
Yeah.
creature in question. Um, it doesn't feel like, and again, this isn't across the board because there's also all sorts of different pet ownerships and stuff, but it does seem like, let's put it this way. I'm quite certain, and I'll bet anything in the world, that any one of my pets, cats, dogs, or whatever, that I've ever had or have still,
Mhm.
if they were given the choice to leave, none of them would want to, because
Yeah.
I'm their family. They want to be with me as much as I want to be with them, kind of thing. And although there
Yeah.
is a certain degree of you taking the choice for them, like we do with our children, I still think
Mhm.
it's a choice that which is why we can boast the implicit consent. I think. I mean, I think implicit consent, although I am also trying to use it for farming, I think
Mhm.
it's much easier to make the case when it comes to the pet scenario,
Yeah.
because
No.
you are literally, bringing them into your family.
Mhm.
And I just think, like, again, like, what happens to all these dogs and cats? I think many of them would choose to be part.
Mhm.
In a lot of cases, and it's not always the case, but in a lot of cases, there is actually some choice there. And do we say, okay, well, if like in the scenario you gave, where the dog came into your open door, and and it felt more voluntary, but I suppose I feel like a lot of cases are like that, or
Mhm.
they would be like that if those parameters were laid out. Like, most people lock their
Yeah.
dogs up not because the dog desperately wants to escape, but because they're worried that it might chase a cat into the road, and they're not there to make sure it doesn't get run
Yeah.
over. It's like a
Yeah.
protection thing rather than an imprisonment thing.
Yeah, no,
So
I
yeah,
get that. And just so you know, so I actually have three rescue guinea pigs. So I have animals that I am a guardian over. um, uh, but it's complicated because I've had conversations with people about this. Some vegans that are actually pro zoos because they'll look at pet ownership in zoos as like kind of heaven compared to the wild, because almost all animals, like less than 5% of animals make it to adulthood, and it's a wild world out there. So it's almost guaranteed to say that there's in most ways, an animal being owned by a human is a better life for it. I am just personally torn by this, and this is the libertarian side of me. I'm torn at this idea of not giving it this chance to be one of the 5%. I almost would connect it with something like if I was visiting some tribe in the rainforest, and let's call this one not the unintelligent one like we talked about earlier. This is just a tribe that's living out there that wants to survive out in the rainforest. And let's say that half of their children die before adulthood, and let's say these conditions are bad compared to what we're used to and what we've figured out. They don't have doctors with these abilities to do these awesome surgeries, and they have access to food, but some people starve. Anyways, if I went there, and they like their way of living and they want to keep living that way, I could take one of their kids and kidnap it and bring it here and give it a better life, the way we could do giving a dog a better life than a wolf might have. Um, and
Yeah, but
it might be right. I just don't
sorry.
know if it's right. I don't know.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. The only pushback I give on that though is like we're not taking the dog from the wild, because I do agree with you. We shouldn't be kidnapping wild animals.
Hmm.
Then we are,
So it's the
that.
continuation to what happened after taking it, I guess.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but my point is we don't know necessarily that that's the dynamic, because like I say, there's a lot of evidence that dogs kind of domesticate themselves a little bit. Like there's a
Yeah,
certain
I've heard
there
that
is
about
there's
cats. I wasn't sure about dogs.
Well, I mean, yeah, it was more kind of thought of with cats, because we even see that today, with regards to cats choosing different owners and stuff, like, and they do act with a bit more independence than dogs, who are, because of their kind of more pack nature,
Hmm.
they're more kind of family orientated. They want a leader to follow and stuff like that, whereas cats are
Hmm.
more kind of independently inclined. So, there's obviously aspects of the nature that fall into it. But the point is, I mean, there are wild dogs, obviously, and wild dog species, but generally speaking, we're not taking them from the wild. If we were to take wolves from the wild and
Hmm.
domesticate them, then I would agree with your argument. I would agree with what you're saying. Even if the people would say, well, yeah, but these wolves might die and they've got like a 10% chance of survival and blah blah blah. You're still
Hmm.
taking them from their natural life. It's very hard to make the argument for implicit contract there. But with regards to already domesticated animals, like that are actually animals that, I mean, like I say, in the cases of dogs and cows, certainly not so much with cats, because cats seem, but there are wild cats that look very much similar to the cats that exist today, and they're very similar to their wild ancestors. But dogs are obviously very different to their
Yeah.
wild ancestors.
Yeah, well, I
Um,
would say how we look at the domesticated ones that we couldn't put back into the wild. It'd be something like the idea of, I would say breeding is likely wrong, if because what makes them different from the wild ones is that they can't survive anymore out in the wild, and so if we're breeding them, that's for our own benefit. I agree with you that once something exists, existing is better than not existing. I don't think making something exist out of nowhere is necessarily better than not existing. So breeding them, I think, is likely wrong. Letting them breed on their own is probably also somewhat likely wrong, but I don't know if that's worse than how we spay and neuter them. In the U.S., the spaying is actual full-on hysterectomy. The uterus is removed. It's kind of wild what we do to animals, cats and dogs. But I would say that that being as horrible as it is, I don't know if it's quite as bad as the amount of strays that are in pounds, having pretty miserable lives, or homeless dogs like on the street. And so I think we need to factor this in if we're in most cases. I think people are using dogs and cats for their own benefit, just for their own personal pleasure. They might call them family, and I agree with you with the idea of how we should view the guardianship, but your average person just goes like, "Oh, that kind's cute. I want this cute one. I want to show it off. It makes me happy." When, it's like the idea of an emotional support animal. It's like, this thing being here makes me happy when I need to be happy. But when I need to be outside, going to get some drinks or going to work, I have no thoughts of what that animal's doing. And it doesn't have any ability to do what it wants to do. So there's just a lot of complications. But I'm torn because I think it is likely having a better life in most regards than way more than your average wild animal.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the reason why, I understand what you're saying. I suppose the reason why I take a slightly different view is, I mean, for one thing, I do think that existence trumps non-existence, even in the case of something that doesn't yet exist. Like
Oh,
I
really? Okay.
like, yeah, I mean, because I think that's part of the justification for having children. Like one of the libertarian questions that's often posed to people with regards to having children is, well, aren't you violating your child's rights because you're bringing it into the world against its without its consent. And
Yeah.
I'm saying, well, yeah, but we're invoking implicit consent because it's reasonable to assume that it would rather existence over non-existence, even from the starting point of before it was ever existing. Like not you exist and it doesn't want to now lose that life. It's like, okay, you don't currently exist, but
Hmm.
you would, if I could have this conversation with you before you exist, which seems a bit hard to do, but
Yeah.
if I could have that conversation with you beforehand and just say, look, would you rather never exist at all, or do you want me to bring you into this world and you
Mm.
experience a life? And again, as long as I meet the requirements for the implicit contract by providing you a life that is worth living, um,
Mm.
then I think it's reasonable to say, that I would do that. And that's why I use I kind of, I mean, the thing is I treat animals and children almost the same, or very,
Mhm.
very similarly. Certainly from the point of view of rights, certainly from the point of view of invoking implicit consent on their behalf. And I think the
Mhm.
reason why is because there's a great similarity there. Like in both cases, they don't have the ability to exercise all their choices because they can't understand them. They don't understand the world around them. We do have to take a quasi authority over them as their guardians, where we have to, lock them in so they don't run out in front of the road at this time, or we do this, that, or another. And there's even the argument to be made that many people will have children for their own selfish reasons because they want children and they're fulfilling their biological needs, and etc., etc. um so I suppose from my point of view, and I don't expect you to share this perspective, but this is just like how I think about it, is I kind of like I try to remove species bias. I try to remove things that I see as arbitrary, and I
Mhm.
just try to think, well, okay, well, what's an objective approach to the ethics here? What's an objective approach to the rights? And I just like the reason why I say that animals have rights is because I can't make an argument for them not. If we have
Mhm.
rights, all of the reasons why we do seems to apply to animals. But the one
Mhm.
thing that people can separate an animal from an adult human is they say, well, animals can't understand contracts, they can't consent to this, they can't do that. And it's like, yeah, okay. So that doesn't mean they don't have the right to make these decisions. They just don't have the
Yeah.
ability. So we make those decisions on their behalf, but we can't make a decision on the behalf of whether it's an animal or a child if we know that decision is something they certainly would not choose. So we have to
Mm.
do it. If we're going to do something on their behalf, we have to employ implicit consent or implicit contract, which, as I say, it's not an exact science, but
Mhm.
there is a certain, it's like a guiding principle that kind of tells you, like, this is the criteria you need to meet, this is the kind of standard that you're working on. Like,
Mhm.
this, like, when I say, well, why is something wrong, it's wrong to, like I say, kidnap a wild animal from its life, but it's not wrong to rescue a chimpanzee from a circus, because you're rescuing it from a terrible situation and you're giving a
Mm.
life that it wouldn't otherwise have. And I would use a similar argument to the cow that doesn't even exist yet, a life that it wouldn't otherwise have, i.e., no life at all, to a life that's actually worth living. And because what you're saying is the reason why I need to do this as part of a deal, I can't just do it out of the goodness of my own heart, is because we're not magical beings that could just create resources out of nothing. If I could provide a life for all animals without having anything in return, then I'd gladly do that. But the fact of the matter is we need a bit of give and take in that. And one of the ways in which these animals can continue to exist and live lives worth living is if, rather than everyone going vegan and wiping out all farming, we could change the dynamics where we recognize animal rights and we employ implicit consent or implicit contracts to demand a standard of living and humane farming. I know people scoff at the idea of humane farming because they feel like it's a contradiction in terms, but I guess I don't. And one of the reasons, and not the only reason, but one of the reasons why I'm not yet a vegan is because, as much as I disagree with how animals are treated now, I do
Mhm.
envisage a way in which we could continue to farm them in a way that does still work within the paradigms of morality and animal rights.
Yeah.
Just like we could have iPhones that don't involve slave labor of third world countries. The
Hmm.
fact that we don't right now doesn't mean I'm not going to own an iPhone, because I need to get by in this world. But I do want to change the world
Yeah.
so these evil things don't happen. And I
Yeah, and
just
there's
think that
different.
there's an alternative, you know?
Yeah, and there's different things that we can do slowly. Yeah, getting better at different changes. I do got to hop off here, but I do want to say, based off what you just said, because you said something about maybe the reason you're not vegan yet, hinting at a possibility of ever becoming vegan. I actually I've been working on what I view as should be the definition of veganism, and you actually are a vegan under my definition. Um, but I think
I eat a
there's
lot of meat to that definition.
well, we might have to have conversations and narrow it down to see if I still hold that opinion. But I think it's complicated because I think being vegan, it has to be on a spectrum. There can't not be a spectrum because there's various forms of things, like if somebody needs a vaccine, an egg is used for the vaccine. Some people are completely vegan, but they also eat a little honey, and the idea of like kicking them out of the group because of something like that. You have various different things, like I've been learning more and more over the weeks about crop deaths and just the various different things, like rodenticide. You put poisons out there, so animals will eat the poison instead of eating the crops. There now, the ultimate thing you'd want to do, like obviously eating the crops that lead to crop deaths, is more humane than eating the animals. But still, there's a want for that future where we figure out a way to get crops without the crop deaths, or in something like lab grown meat, how to get the meat without harming the animals. And luckily, a lot of people, or maybe even most people, are somewhat moral enough to want these changes. But I guess so here's my thoughts on veganism, because there's a main definition from the Vegan Society, which refers to, so it says it's a philosophy and a way of life that seeks to exclude, as far as possible and practicable, um, the use of animals, and then everything after that is boring and pointless. Um, and it's interesting because it uses the word practicable. And now, possible is pointless because if it is practicable, that means it is possible as well. It just means that it is possible with the ability of being successful. And the reason I find this kind of funny is because it would still be up to each individual to decide what they think of as practicable. Not as practical, but as practicable. But even then, it would still be up to the individual. And a thing I've been toying with the idea of is, if a vegan is eating like vegan cakes and donuts and a bunch of unhealthy things, and that is causing crop deaths, then I think it's fine to eat the healthy things that cause crop deaths and to be healthy and to be caring about your own self first. But if you let yourself get over like 100 pounds, and getting over that 100 pounds is for taste pleasure of eating cakes and donuts, is causing this death. It's a moral element that I think vegans need to ponder and think about. And maybe we don't need to have a strict rule that you can't have vegan donuts or whatever. But something like that, being aware of an official item of food being unhealthy by all measures, and then how it affects your body, being overweight yourself. And so, anyways, the when I think of veganism, I like the idea of the word existing as a philosophy itself. So my personal definition is that veganism is a philosophy that seeks to extend moral consideration to animals. And so some people have zero consideration whatsoever. They would eat something that they would know is unhealthy, something like deep fried or breaded or whatever, that causes what happens to pigs in factory farms, which is cutting off their tails, cutting out their teeth, cramming them in small cages. Like it's despicable what they do. And so, for somebody to say that they're willing to put that torture for health, that's kind of complicated too. But at least that's something. But it would be hard for me to trust somebody that would say they align with the philosophy I just described if they would feel fine eating something just for taste pleasure, something unhealthy for their own body that they knew cause like the cutting out of teeth and tails of pigs, like with no anesthetics. They just like feel that pain. They're squealing. It's depressing. So, anyways, it's complicated. From everything I've heard, you sound like you at least are philosophically vegan. Whether you put that into action or not, the best comparison I can do to that is I became vegan like 20 years ago. I was vegan for a year and a half, and I missed meat so much I started eating it again. But I was philosophically vegan that whole time. I felt bad. I thought I shouldn't be doing this. But then I did it, and then I went back to vegan, and then back off vegan, and now I've been vegan for like 8 years straight. And I hope my cravings and my want for dopamine levels to go up don't make me commit immoral acts. But that kind of thing's going to happen here and there. And that's why conversations like this are probably needed. But yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, I understand where you come from. I mean, I still wouldn't call myself a vegan simply, because I obviously eat meat, and I'd feel wrong saying that. And also because I I'm not necessarily, at least at this point, I'm not fighting for a world where everybody is vegan either, because I still feel like we can create one that has meat eating with, within the ethical framework that I outlined of, employing implicit consent and what have you. Like I say, there's a there's a big difference. I mean, you could still, and I'm sure you do as a vegan, still view both as wrong, but I'm sure you can still appreciate the difference between a factory farming scenario and a more idyllic scenario where every effort is being made to meet this implicit contract requirement. I mean, one good example, I know you've got to wrap it up, but one quick example I remember, have you heard of, I think her name is Temple Grande? Have you heard of her?
No.
She's this autistic lady. She's semi-famous. They even did a film about her. She's this autistic lady who basically revolutionized the way the slaughtering of the cattle was done. And she basically had this system that they went through because she noticed that they were becoming terrified during the process, because obviously they were seeing cows being slaughtered in front of them. They were seeing what was happening to them and the way it was done. And basically she said that her autism helped her kind of empathize with the cow to help her design this. But she basically designed a system which was designed, like, the reason for it was to try to take away the suffering as much as humanly possible for the cow, so that when they are sent to slaughter, they don't know what they're going into. They don't see a cow killed in front of them, and the way they're killed is in like the most painless way possible. And whether or not you feel that this is enough, this is the kind of thing that I like to see as a kind of step in the right direction, because
definitely.
one of the things I like about, I have like seen a bit of your work, and obviously it's alluded to a bit in your name, of reasonable vegan, where you're kind of trying to look at like sort of pragmatic options and stuff, is one of the divides I hate to see between vegans and non-vegans is where they meet each other at the extremes, where like the people who are not vegans kind of, because they don't want to face their own guilt, they'd rather just dismiss animal rights altogether, and I don't care about animals, and bacon tastes good, and I'll eat a burger in front of a vegan just to annoy him, and all of this kind of stuff. And then on the vegan side of it, I sometimes see people that get so extreme, well, they'll accuse people of abusing their dogs just for being dog owners or whatever, and they don't have any appreciation for the fact that there are people who eat meat who do still care for animals. I say, well, you can't, it's a contradiction. And I like the fact that you're obviously working in between those extremes.
I think what you just described is what is holding back protecting animals in a big way. Like the amount of people that are probably somewhat like you, that maybe they eat a lot of meat but care about animals. If all of that type of person and all the vegans work together, which there's probably more of your type than there are even vegans, if they all work together, legislation changes would happen like crazy. And they would, even though us vegans aren't a huge fan of animals being killed from free range farms, it's so much better. So if everybody worked together, we could probably end factory farming. There'd be a wild percentage of people that would be demanding from our politicians that pigs need to be in bigger areas. They need to not have their teeth cut off, their tails cut off, all these things. And like, so even though you might eat a pig, you would fight for their rights in this area, but most vegans won't let you. If you don't turn vegan, you don't get to sit with us. And that's the problem. And you should sit with us. And and so we need to that's a Mean Girls reference. I probably should should use a reference that more people might know. But you should be part of the conversation. It shouldn't just be as soon as you cut out every element of what I declare makes you vegan, then you can be part of it. It should be like, no, be part of it. Come here. Like you're wanting to fight for their rights, because I think most vegans look at all or nothing. They say end or end eating animals completely, and that's what I got to fight for. Where they miss out the point that animals and humans, any sentient being, should have the right to not be kicked and slammed against the ground and put in tiny cages. And each of these rights should be equally fought for, I think. So, yeah. But I do actually
agree.
have to hop off here.
Sorry. Okay.
You're fine. I have a 2-hour debate that starts in 18 minutes, and I gotta run. I gotta run and grab coffee and pee and all that good stuff.
Sure, yeah.
But this conversation has been incredible. I've actually loved, especially it's hard to find people that are willing to and wanting to break down those details that we got into in the middle there, talking about pet humans. So I'm glad you were willing to do that, and it was great. And let's do another talk soon.
Yeah, definitely. I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Yep. All right. Sounds good. Take care.
Thanks, mate.
All right. Anybody watching right now? I'm going to hop off here, but then I'm going to be starting up with Angelo. Me and Angelo are going to be doing a follow-up of our debate we had on the definition, and we're just going to go into a handful of things, and it's going to be fun. So yeah, that'll be a separate stream, but that's going to happen in about 15 minutes. And then later at 2 p.m. PST, I got Jeffrey Phillips will be coming on to chat about other vegan stuff. So yeah, fun talks today. All right, take care, guys.